There is a kind of soldier the military has always needed, but never quite known what to do with. Too fast for the generals, too quiet for the medals, too strange for the manuals that were written before anyone understood what the next war would actually look like. History is full of them, men who saw the shape of something new before the institution could name it, who built something extraordinary inside a system that would eventually take it apart with clean, bureaucratic hands. This is the story of those men. In the early months of 1942, the United States was losing, not in the way that gets written into speeches and turned into fuel for patriotism, but losing quietly, structurally, in the particular way that happens when a nation designed for one kind of war suddenly finds itself fighting another. The Pacific was not Europe. The islands were not the fields of France. The enemy had dug in, burrowed deep, turned coral and jungle and volcanic stone into fortresses that conventional assault would crack only at tremendous human cost. The Marine Corps knew this, some of them at least. Among those who understood most clearly was a man named Carlson, a colonel, a thinker, a problem. He had watched the Chinese communist guerrillas fight the Japanese in the 1930s, not from a safe distance, but up close, embedded, learning. He had come back to America with ideas that sat uncomfortably beside the brass, and the tradition, and the polished certainty of military doctrine. He believed that small units, moving fast, striking without warning, sustained by shared belief rather than rank structure, could accomplish what entire battalions could not. He believed, perhaps most controversially of all, that the men under his command should understand why they were fighting, not just follow orders, but hold conviction. The Marine Corps was not entirely sure what to make of him, but the Pacific was burning, and they needed something new. What Carlson and Major James Roosevelt, son of the president, which created its own constellation of complications, built in the months that followed, was unlike anything the American military had produced before. They called them raiders. The word was deliberate. It carried age and edge and a specific implication of speed and disruption. These were not soldiers designed to hold ground. They were designed to appear from nowhere, strike, and dissolve back into darkness before the enemy could organize a response. They were trained in stealth and hand-to-hand combat and psychological endurance. They were taught to endure conditions that would break conventional units. Officers ate beside enlisted men. Rank was a function, not a throne. And over the gate of their purpose, Carlson placed a phrase borrowed from Mandarin, gung-ho, meaning, roughly, work together, though it came to mean something larger and less translatable, a shared ferocity, a collective will, a sense that the unit was the thing worth protecting, not the individual ego within it. They were 200 men at the start, then more, then they were a battalion, and then two, and for a brief, strange, extraordinary window of time, they were something the American military had never sanctioned before, a force built on philosophy as much as firepower. Then they were sent to war, and war, as it always does, had its own ideas. What follows over the next several hours is the complete history of the United States Marine Corps raiders, from the first arguments that brought them into existence, through the jungle operations and island assaults that defined and then destroyed them, to the quiet institutional decision that ended them before the war they had helped to win was even over. It is a story about innovation and the limits of innovation, about what happens when the military produces something it does not entirely control, and what the cost of that discomfort tends to be, measured not in policy papers, but in the lives of the men who believed. You will hear about the raid on Makin Atoll, which was both a success and a warning that nobody quite listened to. About the long march through Guadalcanal's interior, the operation the raiders themselves called the Rat Run, where men walked through weeks of jungle and disease and ambush and came out the other side, changed in ways that do not fit neatly into official after-action reports. About Tarawa, where the raiders found themselves locked in exactly the kind of grinding, frontal, attritional combat they had been specifically designed to avoid, and what that collision between doctrine and reality looked like on the ground. About Iwo Jima and Okinawa, where the veterans of those early operations, scattered now, absorbed into conventional units, their philosophy officially dissolved, kept fighting in a war that had moved far beyond anything they had originally signed up to do. And you will hear about Carlson himself, a man who built something genuine and watched it disassembled, whose health collapsed under the weight of jungle malaria and institutional rejection, who spent the years after the war trying to explain what he had understood, and found that the Cold War world had little appetite for his particular kind of clarity. This is not a straightforward triumph. The raiders did not win the Pacific alone. They were not the decisive force that turned the tide. What they were, what they remain, if you follow the line forward through the decades to the special operations units that carry fragments of their doctrine, is a proof of concept that arrived before the institution was ready to accept it, and paid the price for that timing in ways that are still worth understanding. If you are settling in for the night, this is a good story for that. It is long, and it is layered, and it does not resolve cleanly. The best ones rarely do. The lights can be low, the blanket can be pulled up. What you need is only to listen, and to let the story move at its own pace, which is, like the raiders themselves, unhurried until suddenly it is not. Before we begin, if this kind of documentary is what you come here for, the long-form histories, the stories that fill a night, the deep dives into the men and decisions that shaped the modern world, then consider subscribing. It costs you nothing but a moment, and it means we can keep building these for you. Every subscriber tells us that this matters, that the careful telling of difficult history still has an audience willing to sit with it. Now, settle in. The year is 1941. The Pacific is about to become the most brutal theater of the Second World War, and somewhere in the Marine Corps, a colonel with dangerous ideas is about to get permission to try something that has never been done before. This is the full history of the United States Marine Corps raiders. There is a particular kind of silence that falls over a military institution when it realizes the war it prepared for is not the war it is fighting, not the silence of peace, but the silence of recalculation, of men staring at maps and understanding, with cold clarity, that the plans they spent years refining may be worse than useless. That silence settled over the United States Marine Corps in the final months of 1941, as the Pacific Ocean stopped being a strategic abstraction and became a real and immediate theater of destruction. The Japanese Empire had spent decades fortifying islands across that ocean, coral atolls reinforced with concrete, jungle interiors laced with defensive positions, coastlines designed to kill anything that tried to land on them. The Marines had doctrine for amphibious assault. What they did not have was a credible answer for what happened when the enemy already knew you were coming and had turned every square meter of ground into a killing field. The problem was not courage. It was never courage. The American military had no shortage of men willing to die for their country, and the Marine Corps had spent generations cultivating a culture of aggressive forward action that bordered on the ferocious. The problem was geometry. A frontal amphibious assault against a prepared defensive position is, at its mechanical core, an exercise in trading lives for meters. The attacker gives up surprise. The attacker gives up terrain advantage. The attacker must cross open water, exposed to fire, before he even reaches the ground he intends to fight on. Against a poorly supplied, poorly led, or poorly motivated enemy, those disadvantages can be absorbed through sheer mass and firepower. Against the Imperial Japanese military, disciplined, entrenched, and fighting with a cultural commitment to death before surrender, those disadvantages became a formula for catastrophic loss. The men who understood this were not pessimists. They were mathematicians of violence, and the equation did not work. Into this crisis walked Evans Fordyce Carlson. He was not a conventional officer in any sense that the Marine Corps hierarchy would have found comfortable, and that discomfort would follow him for the rest of his career. Carlson had served in the Marines before the war, left to observe the Chinese Communist Eighth Route Army fighting the Japanese in the late 1930s, and returned to uniform with a head full of ideas that the American military establishment was not architecturally designed to receive. He had watched irregular Chinese fighters conduct operations against a technologically superior Japanese force, using mobility, deception, and what he described as the willingness to accept hardship as a weapon in itself. He had seen men without heavy equipment outmaneuver men with it. He had seen small forces strike, dissolve, and strike again, denying the enemy a fixed target while forcing him to garrison every position, spread thin, and guard against a threat that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. Carlson came back from China not with admiration for communist ideology, but with a military concept. Agility could defeat mass if properly organized and led. The distinction matters because Carlson spent years being misread. His critics would accuse him of importing foreign political philosophy into the American military, and there was enough surface evidence to make that charge stick in certain circles. But the core of what Carlson brought back from China was operational, not ideological. He believed that a small force, trained to an exceptional standard and structured to maximize individual initiative rather than depend on top-down command, could conduct raids against Japanese positions that conventional amphibious landings could not. Hit a target before the enemy had time to respond. Extract before they could counterattack. Strike somewhere else while they were reinforcing the first position. The concept was not complicated. The execution would be. Alongside Carlson stood Major James Roosevelt, the eldest son of President Franklin Roosevelt, whose presence in this story carries a certain biographical irony that the Marine Corps hierarchy was never quite sure how to process. Roosevelt was not a soldier by background or temperament in the conventional sense. He was a political figure, a businessman, a man whose most significant professional qualification was his surname, and yet his connection to the presidency gave the raider concept something that military innovation almost always requires and almost never receives: protection from the institutional immune response. When Carlson needed to argue for resources, for authority, for the right to train men in ways that violated existing doctrine, Roosevelt's proximity to power created space that Carlson alone could never have opened. The two men were different in almost every meaningful way. What they shared was a conviction that the Pacific War demanded something new, and the combined audacity to propose it. The proposal took shape against a backdrop of institutional resistance that was, by any measure, formidable. The Marine Corps in 1941 was an organization that had spent decades fighting for recognition, resources, and relevance within a military establishment dominated by the Army and increasingly contested by the Navy. It had earned its identity through discipline, hierarchy, and a fierce pride in the standard infantryman. The suggestion that a small subset of Marines should be given special status, special training, and special resources operating outside the conventional chain of command was not received as inspiration. It was received as criticism. If the raiders were exceptional, the implication was that the regular Marines were not exceptional enough. That implication had consequences, and the men who felt it most keenly were the ones who would eventually dismantle what Carlson built. The formal authorization came through channels that reflected both the urgency and the politics of the moment. The Marine Corps established the first separate battalion, which would become the 1st Raider Battalion, in early 1942. The speed of its creation was a product of necessity. The Pacific was already burning. The Japanese had struck Pearl Harbor on the 7th of December 1941, and the strategic map had shifted in a matter of hours from theoretical planning to immediate crisis. The argument for unconventional capability did not need to be made in the abstract anymore. It needed to be made in the specific operational language of, what do we do about these islands, these garrisons, these fortified positions that will cost us thousands of men to take by conventional assault? The raiders were one answer to that question, and the fact that the answer was imperfect, contested, and ultimately impermanent does not diminish how desperately it was needed. What Carlson wanted was not a unit that was simply better at the things Marines already did. He wanted a unit organized around a different theory of warfare altogether. Conventional military formations are structured for sustained combat. They absorb casualties, they hold ground, they resupply and reinforce and grind. Raiders were not built for any of that. They were built for the strike, the withdrawal, and the psychological effect of having struck at all. A Japanese garrison that knew raiders operated in their region had to defend every position, every night, against an enemy that might come from any direction. That defensive burden, the cost of uncertainty, was itself a military effect, separate from any individual operation. Carlson understood this in terms that owed more to his observations in China than to anything taught at American military schools, and that understanding was both his greatest contribution and the source of his deepest institutional isolation. The men who would fill the Raider battalions were not yet selected. The training camps were not yet built. The tactics were not yet tested against a real enemy in real conditions. But the concept existed, and the concept was clear enough. Find men willing to move faster, carry less, suffer more, and trust each other more completely than any conventional unit had ever been asked to. Find officers willing to be questioned, willing to eat what their enlisted men ate, willing to lead from a position of earned authority rather than institutional rank. Take everything the Marine Corps prized about itself, the aggression, the resilience, the absolute refusal to quit, and strip away the organizational scaffolding that sometimes made those qualities rigid rather than adaptive. What remained, Carlson believed, would be something the Japanese could not prepare for, because it did not behave like anything they had fought before. Whether that belief was correct is a question this story will not answer quickly. Military innovation is almost never vindicated cleanly. The raiders would fight, bleed, achieve things that no conventional unit could have achieved, and fail in ways that no amount of unconventional thinking could prevent. They would be celebrated and then dismissed, studied and then ignored, disbanded before the war was over, and remembered differently by nearly everyone who had an opinion about them. But at the beginning, in the fractured, urgent months following Pearl Harbor, with the Pacific spreading out like a problem without a solution, the idea that Carlson and Roosevelt brought forward was not reckless. It was responsive. It was a refusal to accept that the only answer to a fortified island was to walk directly into its guns and hope the mathematics eventually favored the attacker. That refusal would cost more than anyone involved was willing to admit at the time. It would cost men their lives in operations that succeeded and operations that failed. It would cost Carlson his health and ultimately his standing in an institution he had served for decades. It would cost the raiders themselves something harder to quantify, the sense, which arrived gradually and never quite departed, that the organization they had built something extraordinary within had decided that extraordinary was not worth the price. But cost comes later. At the beginning, there was only the question, and the question was the same one that every military thinker facing a new kind of war has ever had to answer. If what you have is not enough, what do you build instead? Carlson looked at the Pacific. He looked at the Marines. He looked at what he had seen in China, and he began to answer. There is a particular kind of soldier that institutions produce without meaning to, not the one who follows orders cleanly, who keeps his boots pressed and his paperwork filed, but the one who volunteers for the thing nobody fully understands yet, the assignment with no guarantee of return, no clear definition of success, and no promise of recognition if it works. In the spring of 1942, Evans Carlson began looking for that man, not once, but 200 times over. The call went out quietly, without fanfare, through the channels of a Marine Corps already stretched thin by the shock of Pearl Harbor and the grinding realities of a two-ocean war. Volunteers were sought for unspecified hazardous duty, requiring exceptional physical fitness, mental flexibility, and a willingness to operate outside the conventional framework of military command. The language was deliberately vague. Some men came forward out of curiosity. Some came out of boredom with standard garrison life. Some came because they had heard Carlson's name and felt something pull in them when they heard the word unconventional. Whatever their reason, each volunteer understood, at some level, that they were not signing up for a promotion track. They were signing up for an experiment. Carlson's selection process was nothing like a standard military intake. He did not simply review service records and check physical fitness scores, though both mattered. He talked to men. He sat across from volunteers and asked them questions designed not to extract information, but to reveal character, how a man thought under pressure, whether he could tolerate ambiguity, whether he could follow a leader he disagreed with, and perhaps more critically, whether he could lead other men without needing the authority of rank to compel obedience. Traditional Marine selection valued uniformity. Carlson valued adaptability. These were not the same thing, and he knew it. The men who passed his scrutiny tended to be independent-minded, physically formidable, and possessed of a stubbornness that would have gotten them quietly sidelined in a conventional unit. Here, that stubbornness was considered an asset. Camp Lejeune in North Carolina became the crucible. The land itself offered little in the way of comfort. Swamp, dense timber, coastal plain, and Carlson had no interest in comfort being offered. The battalion that assembled there began its training on a schedule that compressed months of conventional instruction into weeks, and then stripped away everything that was not essential. Sleep was rationed, food was rationed, rest was a concept applied grudgingly, and only when the human body refused to continue. The men ran distances that conventional Marine training did not contemplate, carrying loads that would have seemed excessive to a pack mule, over terrain that offered no clean line of passage. This was not punishment for its own sake. Carlson understood that a raider operating deep behind enemy lines would have no logistics chain to fall back on, no air support to call in, and no friendly perimeter within running distance. The only margin of safety was the physical superiority of the man himself, and that margin had to be built before the mission, not discovered during it. Hand-to-hand combat instruction occupied a central place in the training program, and it was taught without the formality that traditional martial instruction implied. Carlson drew on methods he had observed during time spent with Chinese communist guerrilla fighters in the years before the war. Techniques that were less sport and more survival, oriented not toward winning a fair contest, but toward ending an unfair one as quickly as possible. Men learned to fight with knives, with their hands, with whatever material the environment provided. They were taught that hesitation was a form of surrender, that the moment between deciding and acting was the most dangerous moment in any engagement, and that confidence in close-quarters combat was not arrogance, but a calculated strategic advantage. An enemy who believes he is about to be overwhelmed is already partially defeated. Carlson wanted his men to manufacture that belief in the minds of their opponents before a single shot was fired. Stealth training ran alongside everything else like a second curriculum. The raiders practiced moving through jungle terrain at night, through water, through terrain that resisted passage at every step. They rehearsed ambushes until the choreography became reflex. They learned to move a column of men through forest without sound, which required not merely discipline, but a complete re-education of how the body moved, posture, foot placement, breathing, the management of equipment, so that nothing rattled or snagged. This was painstaking, tedious, and entirely unglamorous work. But Carlson knew that the first warning an enemy garrison received of a raider attack was supposed to be the attack itself, and any noise that preceded it was a liability paid for in blood. What set this training apart from every other elite program in the American military at that time, however, was not the physical regimen. It was what happened between the physical sessions, in the quiet hours of discussion and debate, that Carlson deliberately built into the daily structure. Officers ate at the same tables as enlisted men. Sergeants sat beside lieutenants. Carlson himself ate from the same rations, endured the same conditions, and made himself available for the kind of direct, unmediated conversation that rank normally prohibits. In council sessions that some veteran Marines found deeply uncomfortable, problems were aired openly, decisions were explained rather than simply issued, and junior men were invited to question the reasoning behind orders. This was not democracy in the civilian sense. Orders were still orders, and obedience was still expected, but it was a radical departure from the architecture of authority that the Corps had built over more than a century. Men who understood why they were doing something, Carlson believed, would do it with more commitment and more intelligence than men who were simply told to. The psychological dimension of this approach cannot be separated from its practical effects. Men who were treated as capable of judgment began to exercise judgment. Men who were asked their opinion began to feel ownership over collective decisions. When exhaustion or fear or the shock of unexpected contact threatened to fragment a unit, the cohesion that had been built through this deliberate cultivation of shared purpose held. Veterans of the program would describe it in later years as unlike anything else they had encountered in uniform, not because it was easier, but because it demanded more of the whole person rather than simply the obedient body. The raiders were being prepared not just to fight, but to think, adapt, and survive in conditions where the command structure above them might be unreachable or simply absent. There were, inevitably, men who could not make the adjustment. Some volunteers, capable soldiers by any conventional standard, found the ambiguity intolerable. The absence of clear hierarchy, the expectation of continuous mental engagement, the physical demands layered on top of emotional and philosophical recalibration. For some, this combination produced not resilience but breakdown. They left the program without stigma, returned to conventional units, and in many cases went on to distinguished service in standard infantry roles. Their departure was not failure, in any moral sense. It was simply a recognition that Carlson was building something specific, and that specific thing required a specific kind of man. Not better, necessarily, but different. By the time the battalion reached a state that Carlson considered ready for evaluation, the 200 men who remained had been transformed in ways that were difficult to articulate, but immediately visible to anyone who observed them. They moved differently. They held themselves with the particular economy of motion that prolonged physical conditioning produces. Nothing wasted, nothing performed. They spoke to each other across rank lines without the formal distance that conventional marine culture demanded, and yet the respect between them was by most accounts deeper and more genuine than the enforced deference of standard unit culture. When Carlson walked among them, he was recognized not as a remote authority, but as the architect of something they had collectively built and collectively endured. That relationship between commander and commanded was itself a weapon. The Marine Corps hierarchy watched all of this with a mixture of curiosity and unease. There were officers who saw in Carlson's methods a genuine tactical innovation, a template for the kind of warfare the Pacific was going to demand. There were others who saw a dangerous experiment in military sociology conducted at the expense of discipline and institutional coherence. Both views had merit. The Marine Corps had survived and grown on the strength of its hierarchical culture, its insistence on uniform standards and unified doctrine. Carlson was proposing that doctrine be subordinated to adaptability, that the man be made primary and the structure secondary. This was not simply a tactical argument. It was, at some level, a philosophical one, and the institution had not yet decided what it believed. But the battalion did not wait for the institution to decide. The Pacific was not waiting. Japanese forces were consolidating positions across an archipelago that stretched thousands of kilometers from the Central Ocean outward, and somewhere in that chain of atolls and jungle islands, an unconventional force had its first appointment with proof. 200 men, selected for stubbornness and capability, trained beyond the tolerance of ordinary conditioning, bound together by shared suffering and shared philosophy, were as ready as Evans Carlson could make them. Whether ready was enough would not be settled in the training swamps of North Carolina. That answer was waiting on a coral atoll in the middle of the Pacific, where the doctrine and the men who carried it would meet their first honest test. Before a single shot was fired, before a single island fell to their assault, the raiders faced a war within themselves. Not a war of bullets or jungle terrain, but a war of ideas, a quiet, radical confrontation between the military tradition they had been raised inside and the philosophy that Evans Carlson was about to place in their hands. Most of these men had spent their careers inside a rigid institution that worshipped hierarchy as fervently as it worshipped firepower. Rank was not merely administrative, it was moral, social, existential. It told you where to sit, when to speak, and whose life mattered more in the arithmetic of command. What Carlson was proposing threatened all of that, and in the summer of 1942, inside the training grounds where his new battalion was taking shape, he began to explain exactly what he intended to build. His ideas did not emerge from a classroom or a staff college seminar. They came from China. Carlson had spent years as an observer, embedded with Chinese communist forces, fighting the Japanese in the 1930s, and what he witnessed there had shaken his understanding of how armies could function. He watched poorly equipped, poorly fed soldiers sustain operations that should have been impossible, not because they were driven by fear, not because their officers commanded from armored vehicles at a safe distance, but because they believed in what they were doing and understood why they were doing it. The political dimension of their motivation was something Carlson neither hid nor apologized for. He had seen it work. He had watched collective purpose overcome material disadvantage, and he returned to the United States carrying those lessons like unexploded ordnance, waiting for the right moment to detonate them inside an American military framework. The core of his philosophy rested on a single premise, that a fighting man who understands the reason behind an order will execute it more effectively than one who follows it out of fear of punishment. This was not a new idea in the abstract, but in practice it struck at the foundation of conventional military culture. Officers did not explain themselves to enlisted men. Decisions flowed downward. Obedience was not negotiable. Carlson proposed something fundamentally different, a system in which officers and enlisted men would gather in open council, where plans could be questioned, where the reasoning behind tactical choices would be shared openly, and where every man in the battalion would understand not just what he was being asked to do, but why the mission mattered and how his role connected to it. He called these gatherings gung-ho meetings, and their purpose was as much philosophical as it was practical. He wanted his men to think, not merely obey. The term itself came from the Mandarin phrase meaning to work together, and Carlson adopted it with the same deliberate intention that marked everything else he built. It was a rallying cry, yes, something that could be shouted across a beach or whispered through jungle undergrowth, but it was also a declaration of values compressed into 2 syllables. It captured the entire architecture of what he was trying to construct, a unit where individual ego dissolved into collective function, where the success of the man beside you was indistinguishable from your own success, and where rank conveyed responsibility rather than privilege. The phrase carried its Chinese origin openly, which was itself a provocation to a military establishment already made uncomfortable by what Carlson was teaching. That discomfort would grow considerably in the months ahead. Perhaps nothing made senior Marine Corps officers more uneasy than what happened at mealtimes. In conventional military units, the social geography of a dining facility was a map of hierarchy. Officers ate separately, served first, insulated from the enlisted world by tradition and expectation. Carlson dissolved this entirely. Officers ate with their men, stood in the same lines, received the same food, and sat at the same tables. This was not a symbolic gesture or a morale exercise conducted once for the benefit of a visiting journalist. It was policy, practiced daily, enforced by Carlson's own example. He understood that a leader who separates himself from the people he commands cannot truly know them, and a leader who does not know his men cannot make good decisions about their lives. When an officer shares a meal with the private who sleeps 3 feet away from him in the mud, something shifts in the relationship between them, not a collapse of authority, but a humanization of it. The critics, and there were many, saw it differently. Within the Marine Corps establishment, Carlson's methods were viewed with a mixture of alarm and contempt. The concern was not simply that he was running an unusual unit. Unusual units had existed before. The concern was ideological. Carlson had publicly expressed admiration for Chinese communist organizational methods. He had spoken favorably of collective decision-making, of shared sacrifice, of a model of military organization that looked, to suspicious eyes, uncomfortably close to the political systems that American foreign policy was already beginning to position itself against. The scrutiny was real, and it was sustained. Carlson was watched. His correspondence was monitored. His loyalty, despite an unblemished service record, was quietly questioned in places he could not see and could not directly address. Within the battalion, the gung-ho philosophy produced results that were harder to argue with. Men who had previously been interchangeable parts in a large institutional machine developed a fierce sense of shared identity. They knew each other's names, knew each other's roles, and perhaps more importantly, knew each other's reasoning. The democratic texture of Carlson's councils meant that a sergeant's tactical observation received the same hearing as an officer's. A man who noticed a weakness in a proposed plan was expected to voice it, regardless of his rank. This was disorienting for men who had been trained to suppress exactly that instinct, to subordinate their own judgment to the authority above them. But for those who adapted, it created something unusual and powerful, a unit where collective intelligence replaced individual authority as the primary driver of decision-making. The hand-to-hand and stealth training that defined the battalion physically was inseparable from this philosophical framework. Carlson understood that the kind of warfare he was preparing his men for, small groups, deep behind enemy lines, operating without the weight of artillery or air cover, demanded a different psychological architecture than conventional combat. A man fighting in a large formation can survive on compliance. The machine carries him. A man fighting in a 12-person patrol in a Japanese-held jungle cannot survive on compliance alone. He must think independently, act decisively, and trust the men beside him with an intimacy that conventional military culture actively discourages. The gung-ho philosophy was not separate from the tactical training. It was the foundation that made the tactical training coherent. There was another dimension to what Carlson built that is easy to underestimate, the moral dimension. He told his men, explicitly and repeatedly, what they were fighting for. He connected the immediate violence of their training, the knife work, the night movement drills, the physical brutality of cross-country endurance marches, to a larger story about democracy, about freedom, about the kind of world that would exist if they failed, and the kind that might exist if they succeeded. In this, he was drawing directly on what he had seen in China, where soldiers sustained impossible conditions because they had been given a reason to believe that their suffering served something beyond the ambitions of a distant government. Whether his men shared all of his political convictions was secondary. What mattered was that he gave them a moral vocabulary for their sacrifice, and that vocabulary held them together in moments when physical endurance alone would not have been enough. The military establishment's skepticism never fully hardened into opposition during this period. The raiders were producing results, and results were difficult to argue with in the middle of a war. But the institutional discomfort never disappeared either. Senior officers who visited the battalion observed the open councils, the mixed dining, the absence of the crisp social segregation they considered essential to military order, and they did not always like what they saw. Some reported their concerns upward, others simply waited, confident that the war would eventually demand conformity from even the most unconventional formations. They were not wrong. But in the summer of 1942, that reckoning was still ahead, and for the moment, Carlson's experiment was breathing and moving and filling itself with the particular intensity that comes from men who believe, genuinely, not performatively, that what they are doing matters. What Carlson had created was not a military unit in the conventional sense. It was a community organized around the idea that collective will could replace material advantage, that shared purpose could sustain men through conditions that would collapse less cohesive groups, and that the relationship between a leader and his people did not have to be built on distance and fear to be effective. Whether this was wisdom or naivety would be tested soon enough. The jungle would offer no ideological accommodations. Japanese machine guns did not care whether a man ate beside his officers or apart from them. But what the gung-ho philosophy produced, in the months before combat, inside the training grounds where the raiders were still only a theory about what American soldiers could become, was something that no amount of conventional drilling would have generated on its own. a group of men who trusted each other completely, who understood their mission in its full moral weight, and who were ready, or believed they were ready, for whatever came next. The Pacific Ocean, in the dying weeks of summer 1942, offered no mercy to the men who sailed across it. Two submarines, long, black shapes pressing beneath the surface, carried 217 Marines westward through warm, dark water. The submarines ran submerged through the daylight hours, cramped and airless, the temperature inside the pressure hulls climbing to a level that made sleep nearly impossible. Men pressed together in the narrow passageways, their equipment stacked around them, their bodies slick with sweat. They had trained for months for precisely this kind of operation: a sudden strike, a violent disruption, a clean extraction, but no amount of training had prepared them for the physical degradation of the approach. They were Carlson's Raiders, the first American unconventional strike force of the Pacific War, and they were sailing toward a coral atoll most of them could not have found on a map 6 months earlier. Makin Atoll, in the Gilbert Islands chain, sat roughly 3,000 kilometers southwest of Hawaii, a thin crescent of land barely elevated above the surface of the ocean. The Japanese garrison there was not large by the standards of the war being fought elsewhere in the world, but it was real, armed, and prepared to fight. The strategic logic behind the Makin raid was straightforward, though the pressures that produced it were complex. American planners needed intelligence about Japanese defensive postures across the Central Pacific, and they needed to demonstrate that the United States could reach beyond the defensive perimeter and strike. There was a secondary purpose that no official document needed to state plainly. The raiders had to prove they existed for a reason. Back at headquarters in Washington and at Marine Corps Command, skepticism about Carlson's unconventional unit had never fully gone away. Officers who had watched the gung-ho councils and the deliberate erosion of rank hierarchy viewed the whole enterprise with barely concealed contempt. A successful raid would silence critics, at least temporarily, and generate the kind of public narrative that a nation absorbing defeat after defeat in the Pacific desperately needed. Carlson understood this. He was not naive about the political dimensions of military operations. He had spent time observing Chinese communist guerrilla forces before the war and had seen how morale, narrative, and purpose could sustain fighters through conditions that pure logistics alone could not explain. He intended Makin to be proof of a concept, a demonstration that small, mobile, psychologically resilient men could hurt a modern military power in ways that a conventional force could not. The submarines surfaced in darkness on the appointed morning, and the raiders began their approach to shore in rubber boats, folding, pneumatic craft that represented the practical limit of 1942 amphibious technology for small unit operations. Almost immediately, the Pacific asserted itself. The surf along Makin's shore was rougher than intelligence estimates had suggested, and several boats capsized in the dark water. Men scrambled back to the surface, fighting to recover weapons and equipment before the ocean took them. Some gear was lost. Some men were separated from their units in the confusion and darkness. The carefully rehearsed choreography of the landing began to fray before the first shot had been fired. This was, in a sense, the first lesson Makin had to teach, that the gap between training conditions and actual conditions in war is not a minor adjustment, but a fundamental transformation of reality. What had worked in the controlled chaos of Camp Lejeune did not translate cleanly to a coral island in the Central Pacific at 0 dark hours, with a breaking surf and a Japanese garrison a few hundred meters away. Despite the chaotic landing, enough men reached the shore in sufficient order to execute the initial assault. Carlson organized his force and moved inland. The Japanese garrison, estimated at several hundred men, was distributed across the atoll's main island, and the raiders hit them hard in the opening hours. The early fighting was fierce and close, the kind of combat that the raiders had trained for, where individual initiative, aggression, and the willingness to close with the enemy at short range determined the outcome more than firepower or position. The gung-ho philosophy, so easy to mock in the parade grounds of the American Southeast, produced exactly the psychological product it had promised in those first hours of contact. Men who had debated tactics in council, eaten beside their officers, and trained until physical limits became irrelevant, did not freeze when the shooting started. They moved, they adapted, they pressed the attack without waiting for orders that might never come. Japanese resistance was real and determined, but the raiders overran the garrison's initial defensive positions with a speed and violence that Japanese commanders had not anticipated. But war does not remain in its first hours. The day wore on, and with it came the complications that Carlson had not been able to plan for, and that no training could replicate. Communications equipment, soaked during the landing, performed poorly. The picture of Japanese strength and dispositions that intelligence had assembled proved incomplete in several significant areas. Japanese reinforcements, arriving by seaplane and small craft, introduced fresh enemy combatants into a situation that had seemed, for a brief time, to be moving toward resolution. Carlson and his officers made decisions in real time with imperfect information, which is the permanent condition of combat. But the particular imperfections here had consequences. The operation, conceived as a sharp one-day strike followed by rapid extraction, extended into a second day, then a third, then a fourth. Every additional hour on the atoll increased the probability that Japanese naval and air forces would arrive in strength sufficient to trap the raiders entirely. The men who had trained for speed and deception found themselves in a sustained engagement on a piece of ground from which they could not easily leave. The fighting across those days was not a continuous pitched battle, but a series of sharp engagements, lulls, movements, and feints, the rhythm that close jungle and scrub terrain imposes on infantry regardless of doctrine. The raiders suffered casualties. 9 men were killed in action during the course of the operation, a figure that sounds modest against the scale of losses the Pacific War would eventually generate, but which represented individual men Carlson had selected, trained, and in many cases personally known. Each loss carried weight beyond its number, because the unit was small enough that every man understood every other man's role. The Japanese losses were substantially higher, and by any conventional military accounting, the raiders had achieved what they came to do. The garrison was disrupted. Intelligence was gathered. The Japanese position on Makin was neutralized, at least temporarily. Against the goals stated in the operational orders, Makin was a success. Yet success and clarity are rarely the same thing in war, and Makin produced neither. The extraction, the return to the submarines, became an ordeal that tested the raiders as severely as the fighting had. The surf that had complicated the landing had not grown calmer, and moving men and equipment back through it under pressure, in the dark, with an uncertain enemy presence behind them, produced a kind of controlled desperation. Boats capsized again. The physical exhaustion that had accumulated across 4 days of combat in tropical heat made every movement heavier, every mistake more costly. The submarines waited at sea, and the raiders had to reach them across water that did not cooperate. The extraction stretched across hours that felt longer than the days of fighting that preceded them. When the submarines finally submerged with the bulk of the force aboard, it was with the raw, ragged feeling of men who had narrowly avoided something worse than what they had experienced. The aftermath of any operation begins before the shooting stops. It begins the moment the first thing goes wrong, and in every operation, something goes wrong. Carlson understood this, but understanding did not insulate him from the scrutiny that Makin generated within the Marine Corps and among American strategic planners. The operation had been longer than planned, the extraction had been disorganized, and the logistical fragility of the whole enterprise had been visible to anyone paying close attention. Critics who had doubted the raider concept from the beginning pointed to the gaps between the planned operation and the actual one as evidence that unconventional tactics produced unconventional problems, and that those problems, multiplied across a larger campaign, would become catastrophic. Carlson's defenders pointed to the same operation and saw proof that the concept worked, that 217 men had struck a Japanese garrison of several hundred and come back with most of their force intact, carrying intelligence and a propaganda victory of genuine value. Both readings of the same set of facts were honest, which is what made the argument so difficult to resolve. There was one dimension of the Makin raid that sat outside the reach of both the critics and the defenders, and that was what it had done to the men who survived it. They had crossed a threshold that training, however brutal, cannot fully replicate. They had killed men and watched men die. They had felt the specific, irreducible weight of combat, the way time moves differently when death is a near probability, the way the body's chemistry changes under sustained fear and sustained aggression, and the way that change does not entirely reverse when the danger passes. The raiders who climbed back into those submarines carried Makin with them in ways they could not fully articulate and would not fully understand for years. The gung-ho spirit that Carlson had built was still present, still real, but it had been tested against the actual conditions of a Pacific island in wartime, and it had emerged changed, less idealistic, more hard-edged, shaped by the specific knowledge that innovation did not guarantee survival, and that the gap between a good plan and a good outcome was wider than any doctrine could close. The American public received the Makin raid as something close to pure triumph. News coverage, carefully shaped by wartime information policy, emphasized the audacity of the operation and the professionalism of the men who had executed it. The raiders became, briefly, a source of national pride at a moment when the Pacific War was producing very little to be proud of. Carlson became a figure of public fascination, the unconventional officer with the foreign ideas and the extraordinary results. The gap between the public narrative and the operational reality was substantial, but it was not dishonest in its essentials. The raiders had gone in, done what they came to do, and come back. In 1942, in the Pacific, that was not a small thing. What Makin actually revealed, stripped of both the criticism and the celebration, was something more uncomfortable than either position acknowledged. It revealed that the raiders were capable of exactly what they had been built to do, and that what they had been built to do existed only under very specific conditions. A small force, a limited objective, a defined time frame, a reliable extraction route. Change any one of those conditions significantly, and the raider model began to show stress fractures. Makin had changed all of them, to some degree, and the fractures had appeared. The operation was 4 days long instead of 1. The extraction was chaotic instead of clean. The intelligence picture was incomplete, and 9 men who had volunteered for this force, who had trained alongside Carlson and absorbed his philosophy and believed in what they were building, did not come home. The raiders had drawn first blood at Makin, but the blood was not entirely their enemies. The boats were supposed to be waiting. That was the plan. Clean, fast, merciless. Strike hard, pull back before the enemy could organize a coherent response, and vanish into the Pacific darkness the way the raiders had arrived, as ghosts with rifles. But the ocean does not negotiate with plans, and the morning of the withdrawal from Makin Atoll arrived not with order, but with chaos so complete it nearly swallowed the operation whole. The surf that had complicated the landing now turned outright hostile, flipping rubber boats in the breakers, scattering equipment, and separating men from their units in the darkness before dawn. What had been designed as a surgical extraction became something far uglier, a desperate scramble against time, tide, and an enemy that was no longer surprised. The Japanese garrison at Makin, whatever its initial confusion, had found its footing. By the time the raiders began their withdrawal, the enemy was pressing from multiple directions simultaneously, probing the perimeter with a persistence that made every minute on that atoll feel borrowed. The raiders had trained for this, for the psychological pressure of fighting while moving, for maintaining discipline when the instinct was to sprint. But training for something and living through it are separated by a distance no barracks exercise can fully close. Men who had operated with precision during the raid itself now had to hold cohesion together at the seams, fighting rearguard actions while carrying their wounded toward boats that the surf kept refusing to cooperate with. The physical and mental toll of more than 48 hours of continuous combat compressed onto every decision being made at the water's edge. 9 Marines did not make it back. That number, 9, sits in the historical record with the cold weight that only casualty figures carry. Each of those 9 men had volunteered, had been selected, had trained through the punishing regimen at Camp Lejeune that was meant to prepare them for precisely this kind of operation. They had believed in the philosophy that Carlson preached, that a small, disciplined, intelligent force could accomplish what larger, slower units could not, and in many respects, they had proven it. The raid itself had disrupted Japanese logistics, destroyed infrastructure, and demonstrated that the American military was willing to bring aggression directly to the enemy's doorstep. But the extraction revealed something the planning had not fully accounted for, that even the most carefully conceived unconventional operation carries a human ledger, and someone has to pay it. The circumstances surrounding those 9 deaths became a source of intense, anguished discussion among the survivors. Some had been killed in the fighting itself, cut down during the rearguard actions that kept the Japanese from overwhelming the withdrawal. Others were casualties of the surf, the churning, indifferent Pacific that swallowed men and boats without discrimination. And then there were those whose fate became an open wound in the collective memory of the battalion. Marines who, in the confusion of the extraction, were initially believed to have been left behind. The uncertainty that followed, the question of whether living men had been abandoned on Makin, haunted the unit's veterans and its commanders alike. Carlson's philosophy had been built on collective responsibility, on the idea that every man was accountable to every other man. The possibility, however murky in the chaos of withdrawal, that some had been left to face the Japanese alone, cut directly against everything the raiders stood for. The submarine skippers who had delivered the raiders to Makin and waited offshore for their return faced their own impossible mathematics. Extraction windows are not infinite. Enemy air and surface assets had already been alerted by the raid, and remaining surfaced for extended periods in contested waters was a risk the submarine commanders could not absorb indefinitely. The pressure to close the hatches and dive was real and legitimate, and it collided head-on with the Marines' desperate need for more time. In the fog of that collision, in the brutal arithmetic of military necessity, decisions were made that no one would look back on without regret. The sea took some of what the fighting had not, and the submarines finally submerged, carrying men who would spend the voyage home questioning what had happened in those final minutes on the water. When the raiders returned, and the after-action reports began circulating through Marine Corps Command, the criticism came quickly and from several directions at once. Some of it was tactical, legitimate questions about the adequacy of pre-operation planning, the reliability of rubber boat extractions in Pacific surf conditions, and whether the intelligence picture of Makin's garrison had been sufficiently precise to justify the risk. These were the kinds of criticisms that any serious military institution should ask after any operation, and they deserved honest answers. But not all of the criticism was so disinterested. There were officers within the Marine Corps hierarchy who had watched Carlson's experiment with unconcealed skepticism from its earliest days, men who regarded the raider concept less as innovation and more as an institutional affront, a suggestion that conventional marine doctrine was somehow insufficient. For those officers, Makin's troubled extraction was confirmation they had been waiting for. They pointed to the 9 dead, to the near disaster at the water's edge, to the logistical improvisation that had characterized the withdrawal, and argued that a unit trained to abandon traditional structure had predictably come apart when conditions turned adverse. This was not entirely fair. The raiders had accomplished their primary objectives and returned the vast majority of their force. But fairness was not always the operating currency of institutional rivalry. The Marine Corps in 1942 was an organization under extraordinary pressure, fighting a war it had been preparing for in theory, and was now executing in brutal practice, and internal arguments about doctrine carried the additional weight of wounded pride and professional competition. Carlson himself absorbed the criticism with a composure that masked considerable private turmoil. He was a man who had staked not just his career, but his entire conception of what warfare could be on the raider experiment, and the imperfect outcome at Makin forced him to confront the distance between his philosophy and the reality that combat imposes on philosophy without apology. He had argued for months that small units operating with collective purpose and psychological sophistication could outperform larger, more rigid formations. Makin had provided evidence both for and against that argument simultaneously, which is perhaps the most honest thing any combat operation can offer, and also the most politically inconvenient. Carlson wrote his reports, accepted his debriefs, and prepared his battalion for what was coming next. But the institutional clock had begun ticking in ways he may not yet have fully understood. The families of the 9 who did not return received the news that every military family dreads: the knock, the uniform at the door, the words that split time permanently into before and after. What those families knew of the Makin raid was almost nothing. The operation had been conducted under tight operational security, and the details that filtered through official channels were carefully managed. They knew their sons and husbands had died in service of their country in the Pacific. The specific texture of what had happened, the surf, the confusion, the rearguard fighting, the agonizing questions about who had been left and who had not, belonged to the men who had survived it. Grief at that scale has no need for tactical precision. It simply occupies whatever space it finds. The broader American public, meanwhile, received a version of the Makin raid that emphasized its audacity rather than its cost. Wartime information management had a logic of its own. National morale required stories of American initiative striking back at the enemy who had ambushed the fleet at Pearl Harbor less than a year earlier. The raiders became a symbol of American aggression and ingenuity, celebrated in newspapers and radio broadcasts in terms that the men who had actually been there would have found both gratifying and slightly unrecognizable. Success, when it is reported at sufficient distance from its complications, tends to acquire a simplicity it never possessed in the moment. The raiders had done something genuinely difficult and genuinely significant. But the gap between what they had accomplished and how it was narrated would only grow wider as the war continued. Within the raider battalions, the Makin operation settled into memory as something more complicated than either triumph or disaster. It was a proving ground that had proven several things at once, not all of them comfortable. The men who had fought there knew they could execute a strike operation against a defended position in darkness, sustain combat through day and night, and withdraw under fire. They also knew that rubber boats and Pacific surf were an unreliable combination, that rearguard discipline under sustained pressure was among the hardest things human beings can be asked to maintain, and that no planning process is thorough enough to anticipate the specific form that chaos will take on a given night on a given beach. These were lessons worth having. They came at a price that would continue to be debated long after the men who paid it were gone. What Makin ultimately revealed was not the failure of the raider concept, but the fundamental nature of unconventional warfare itself, that it operates closest to the edge, where the margin for error is thinnest and the consequences of miscalculation most immediate. The Marine Corps would not fully reckon with that revelation for months, and when it did, the reckoning would come not through careful philosophical debate, but through the grinding, merciless experience of campaigns that made Makin look, in retrospect, almost small. The 9 dead would be joined by many more. The questions raised in those final hours at the Makin waterline, about extraction, about doctrine, about the human cost of innovation, would echo forward through every operation the raiders fought, growing louder with each one, until the institution that had created them finally decided the echo was too much to bear. Guadalcanal was not a raid. It was not a swift strike followed by clean extraction, not a controlled experiment in speed and surprise. It was a prolonged, suffocating argument between men and jungle, between human endurance and an island that seemed engineered to break both. When Carlson's 1st Raider Battalion arrived in the autumn of 1942, they stepped into a campaign that had already been grinding for weeks, a campaign where the very ground beneath their boots conspired against them as readily as any enemy soldier. The Raiders had been built for short, violent contact and rapid withdrawal. What Guadalcanal offered them was something altogether different: weeks without end, heat without relief, and a darkness so complete that the jungle itself became a weapon. The strategic picture around Guadalcanal in September of 1942 was one of grinding uncertainty. American forces had seized Henderson Field, the island's critical airstrip, but Japanese troops remained deeply embedded across the interior, moving through ridgelines and river valleys, probing American perimeters, and maintaining supply routes that fed their resistance. The raiders were not inserted to hold a line. They were inserted to find the enemy where he hid, to disrupt his movement, and to destroy his capacity to threaten the airfield from the jungle's interior. It was, in principle, exactly the kind of mission Carlson had spent 2 years preparing his men for. In practice, the jungle reduced every principle to rubble within the first few hours of movement. The operation that followed became known as the Long Patrol, though Marines who survived it would give it darker names in the years after. For roughly 30 days, Carlson led his raiders in a sweeping arc through the island's mountainous interior, moving without roads, without consistent resupply, and without any of the tactical clarity that planning maps suggested was possible. Every river crossing was a negotiation with current and concealment. Every ridgeline was a potential ambush position that had to be cleared before it could be crossed. The jungle canopy overhead was so dense that daylight arrived as a pale, filtered suggestion rather than a fact, and the men moved through perpetual shadow, their senses tuned to sounds that might indicate contact. the crack of a branch, the absence of birdsong, the soft disturbance of undergrowth that should not have been disturbed. The raiders had trained for this. Training had not been sufficient preparation. Carlson adapted his tactics constantly. He broke his battalion into smaller columns, sometimes as few as a few dozen men, that could move independently, strike Japanese supply lines and patrols, and then consolidate before any enemy counterattack could fix them in place. It was the gung-ho philosophy applied under live fire. Decentralized authority, trust pushed down to squad leaders, decisions made at the point of contact rather than relayed up a chain of command that had no visibility on the ground. When a patrol encountered Japanese soldiers moving along a jungle track, the sergeant at the front made the call. When a flank collapsed under fire, the nearest officer reorganized without waiting for orders from above. The system worked, fitfully, imperfectly, at genuine cost, but it worked. The raiders killed. They killed consistently, repeatedly, across engagements that ranged from brief, violent contacts lasting seconds to drawn-out firefights in terrain where neither side could see the other clearly. The human cost began accumulating not only in combat, but in the spaces between combat. Malaria moved through the battalion with a patience and thoroughness that no Japanese force could match. Men who had pushed through the initial stages of fever, the chills, the sweating, the crushing headache, continued to march because stopping meant being left, and being left in that jungle meant dying. Rations ran thin and then ran out, replaced by what could be carried in on resupply drops that were irregular at best and absent at worst. The raiders began eating whatever the island offered, coconuts where they could find them, captured Japanese rice when patrols overran enemy positions, the occasional local food brought forward by Guadalcanal's indigenous scouts, who proved invaluable in ways that no planning document had anticipated. Carlson was scrupulous in acknowledging this debt. The raiders did not navigate that jungle alone, and the men knew it. By the middle weeks of the patrol, the battalion's physical condition had deteriorated to a degree that would have alarmed any medical officer seeing them fresh. Men had lost significant body weight, boots had rotted, jungle sores opened on skin that never fully dried. Yet the raiders continued to function as a military unit, continued to find the enemy, to fix him, and to destroy him in contact after contact. The estimated count of Japanese soldiers killed during the long patrol reached toward 400, a figure that represented not a single dramatic engagement, but the cumulative result of dozens of small actions, ambushes set along supply trails, strikes on resting columns, sudden assaults on positions that had not yet been properly fortified. Each action was brief by design. Carlson pulled his men back before the enemy could mass sufficient force to encircle them. It was precisely what the raiders had been built to do, and in the jungle interior of Guadalcanal, it worked with a kind of terrible efficiency. The cost, measured against that efficiency, was the question that Carlson and his commanders would argue over for months afterward. The raiders suffered casualties from enemy fire, men killed in ambushes and firefights, men wounded and carried through jungle that made every 100 meters of evacuation a profound physical ordeal. But the larger toll came from disease and physical attrition. Malaria claimed more raiders than Japanese bullets. Exhaustion accumulated in the body like debt, and by the final days of the patrol, some men were functioning on reserves that had been drawn down past any reasonable margin. The battalion that emerged from the jungle at the end of the long patrol was recognizable as a military unit only in the most formal sense. It was a collection of gaunt, fever-burned men who had accomplished something extraordinary and were in no condition to appreciate what they had done. Carlson's leadership during those weeks remained a subject of profound loyalty among the men who served under him. He ate what they ate, marched where they marched, and made no claim to comfort or protection beyond what the most junior private received. Officers in his command operated the same way. The gung-ho compact held even when the jungle was doing its worst. When decisions had to be made about which direction to move or how to respond to unexpected contact, Carlson listened to sergeants as readily as he listened to captains. There were men in that battalion who had never served in any military organization that functioned this way, and who would never serve in one again. The memory of it stayed with them for the rest of their lives. The specific sensation of being trusted completely, of having their judgment treated as essential rather than merely tolerable. The operation's success, such as it was, did not go uncontested within the Marine Corps hierarchy. Officers who had watched the raiders consume resources, ammunition, food, medical supplies, supporting fires, the time and attention of higher commanders, while operating largely beyond conventional supervision, were not uniformly impressed by the casualty exchange. 400 Japanese soldiers dead was a significant number. So was the condition of the battalion at the patrol's end. The argument that would eventually dismantle the raider program entirely was already forming in the minds of men who looked at Guadalcanal's long patrol and saw not a vindication of unconventional warfare, but a demonstration of its hidden costs. They were not entirely wrong. Innovation that destroys the innovators is not sustainable, and the raiders had very nearly destroyed themselves in proving what they could do. What Guadalcanal established beyond any argument was that the raiders could sustain operations across weeks rather than days, could function cohesively under conditions that would have disaggregated most conventional units, and could impose genuine operational damage on a determined enemy without fixed positions or predictable lines of advance. These were real achievements. They were also achievements that raised an uncomfortable question. If the raiders could do this, could they do it again? Could the same men, or men like them, absorb the same attrition and emerge capable of repeating the effort? The answers that the following months would provide were largely discouraging. The battalion needed weeks to reconstitute. Individual Marines needed months to recover from malaria and malnutrition. The human instrument that Carlson had forged was also, it turned out, a human instrument, subject to the same biological limits as any other collection of men in a tropical war zone. The survivors of the long patrol carried Guadalcanal in their bodies in ways that did not fully resolve. Men who had contracted malaria on the island would suffer recurring fevers for years. Men who had pushed their physical reserves past the edge during those weeks of jungle movement found that certain capacities did not entirely return. The specific weight of exhaustion that accumulated during sustained operations without adequate food or rest left a residue that no amount of recovery time fully cleared. When Carlson's raiders eventually reformed and redeployed, they were a somewhat different unit than the one that had entered that jungle, more experienced surely, and carrying a hard-won knowledge of what sustained combat actually required, but also diminished in ways that were difficult to quantify and impossible to ignore. The jungle of Guadalcanal did not care about doctrine. It did not recognize the difference between a raider and a regular Marine, between a volunteer who had embraced an unconventional philosophy and a conscript who had been assigned to a standard rifle company. It offered the same fever, the same rot, the same darkness to all of them. What the raiders brought to it was a specific way of moving and thinking and deciding, a philosophy that had been built in training and tested at Makin and now pressed against something far larger and more demanding than any single raid could have prepared them for. They had not broken. That was not a small thing. In the middle of a war that was breaking units and formations with frequency, the raiders had moved through 30 days of sustained jungle combat and emerged on the other side, reduced but intact, carrying their dead and their doctrine forward into whatever came next. While Carlson's 1st Raider Battalion was beginning its savage ordeal on Guadalcanal in September 1942, the Marine Corps leadership faced a strategic question that would shape the entire Raider program. If raids on small islands were to become doctrine rather than exception, then a single battalion operating under one commander would never suffice. The military machine required redundancy, scalability, and institutional ownership. What had begun as Carlson's personal experiment needed to become a system that could function independent of any single visionary. In response, the Marine Corps authorized the formation of a 2nd Raider Battalion, one that would operate under separate command and diverge fundamentally from Carlson's radical philosophy. This decision, made with bureaucratic efficiency rather than strategic clarity, would create 2 separate cultures within the same regiment, each competing for resources, prestige, and the legitimacy to define what raider warfare truly meant. The 2nd Battalion's commander was Lieutenant Colonel Evans Carlson's protégé, in title only. While Carlson had handpicked volunteers from across the Marine Corps and remade them in his own ideological image, the 2nd Battalion's leadership came from the conventional military hierarchy. These were officers trained in traditional command structure, men who saw the raider concept as a tactical tool rather than a revolutionary experiment in human organization. Where Carlson's 1st Battalion had dissolved rank during evening councils and allowed enlisted men to speak directly to officers about operational decisions, the 2nd Battalion maintained clearer lines of authority. Officers slept in separate quarters, ate at separate tables, and made decisions through the established chain of command. The emphasis shifted from collective discipline rooted in Chinese military philosophy towards something closer to aggressive conventional tactics conducted by smaller, more mobile units. The difference was subtle but profound. The 2nd Battalion would raid like Americans, not like a revolutionary army that happened to wear Marine uniforms. Recruitment for the 2nd Battalion followed a different pattern than the volunteer system that had created Carlson's original force. While the 1st Battalion had drawn men who were intellectually sympathetic to experimentation and willing to embrace organizational chaos in pursuit of tactical innovation, the 2nd Battalion could rely on the prestige that the 1st Battalion's early success had created. Young Marines saw the Raider name as synonymous with combat effectiveness and elite status, even if they did not fully grasp the philosophical underpinnings of Carlson's vision. Officers selected men based on physical capability and demonstrated combat readiness rather than ideological conviction. The 2nd Battalion attracted ambitious junior officers and sergeant-level commanders who saw Raider service as a stepping stone toward advancement in a post-war military hierarchy. This created a fundamentally different organizational culture, one focused on measurable outcomes and professional advancement rather than on the egalitarian collective that Carlson had attempted to build. The training regimen for the 2nd Battalion reflected these organizational differences. Both units emphasized physical conditioning, weapons proficiency, and the specialized skills required for amphibious infiltration and rapid withdrawal. Both conducted night operations, practiced coordinated small unit tactics, and drilled their men in the discipline required for prolonged jungle operations. Yet the 2nd Battalion's training incorporated more emphasis on conventional fire support and integration with standard marine artillery and air assets. Carlson's 1st Battalion had treated support elements as supplementary to the raiders' autonomous action. The 2nd Battalion saw them as essential components of a unified tactical system. The philosophical emphasis shifted from Carlson's stress on psychological resilience and moral commitment toward a more mechanistic understanding of combat effectiveness. Raiders were still elite, but they were elite through martial skill rather than through collective consciousness. The difference was subtle enough that an outside observer might have missed it, yet profound enough that it would shape how each battalion approached every operation they undertook. Leadership personalities within the 2nd Battalion created yet another layer of cultural distinction. Carlson had been a singular figure, a Chinese-speaking officer with radical political sympathies and a visionary belief that warfare could be transformed through human organization. The 2nd Battalion, by contrast, was led by multiple officers who brought different temperaments and tactical philosophies to their roles. Some saw the raider concept as requiring lighter, faster operations than conventional warfare, but stopping short of Carlson's revolutionary approach to command structure. Others viewed the raiders as essentially conventional Marines who happened to specialize in rapid strikes, a tactical variant rather than a philosophical transformation. This diversity of leadership created flexibility within the 2nd Battalion, but also made it difficult to identify a consistent doctrine or approach. Where the 1st Battalion spoke with one voice and operated according to Carlson's vision, the 2nd Battalion was a coalition of leaders with overlapping but not identical understandings of what raider warfare entailed. As both battalions became operational realities competing for resources within the larger Marine Corps system, tensions emerged that went far beyond military tactics. Senior officers within the Marine Corps headquarters were divided on the raider concept itself. Traditionalists saw the raiders as an expensive luxury that diverted experienced personnel from conventional units and consumed resources disproportionate to their contribution. They pointed to the Makin raid's high casualty rate relative to the tactical accomplishment and questioned whether innovative tactics could justify the organizational disruption that the 1st Battalion created. Advocates for the Raider program saw both battalions as pioneering a necessary evolution in modern warfare. They argued that as Japanese garrisons became more dispersed across the Pacific, the ability to strike rapidly at isolated positions would become increasingly valuable. The Marine Corps' officer corps became a battleground between these competing visions, with the 1st and 2nd Raider battalions unwittingly becoming proxies for larger disputes about military doctrine and institutional identity. The relationship between Carlson's 1st Battalion and the newly formed 2nd Battalion was marked by an unspoken rivalry that operated beneath the surface of official courtesy. Men in the 1st Battalion had volunteered explicitly to serve under Carlson and had embraced his radical approach to command structure and collective discipline. They saw themselves as true believers in a revolutionary military experiment, willing to endure greater hardship because their sacrifice was in service of something larger than mere tactical success. The 2nd Battalion's men, by contrast, had often been assigned rather than self-selected, and they operated within more conventional command structures. 1st Battalion veterans viewed the 2nd Battalion as less truly committed to the Raider ideal, as soldiers playing at being elite, rather than genuinely transformed by the experience. 2nd Battalion personnel, meanwhile, sometimes viewed the 1st Battalion's emphasis on collective discipline and egalitarian decision-making as pretentious and potentially militarily unsound. The two units competed for the same equipment allocations, the same opportunities for combat operations, and the same limited pool of experienced officers who could lead Raider training. What had begun as institutional redundancy evolved into quiet conflict over scarce resources and prestige. The operational readiness of the 2nd Battalion followed a compressed timeline as the Marine Corps sought to demonstrate that the raider concept could function at scale. While Carlson's 1st Battalion had trained for months before its maiden operation at Makin, the 2nd Battalion underwent a shortened training cycle before receiving its own combat assignment. Senior leadership wanted to prove that raider tactics could be replicated and systematized rather than depending entirely on Carlson's personal vision. The accelerated preparation meant that while the 2nd Battalion achieved basic competency in rapid insertion, small unit tactics, and survival in hostile terrain, it never achieved the deep cultural cohesion that had characterized Carlson's original force. Officers and enlisted men did not undergo the shared trial of collective decision-making and egalitarian meal lines that had bonded the 1st Battalion into a nearly familial organization. The 2nd Battalion was effective as a military unit, but it remained a military unit rather than becoming the kind of unified organism that Carlson had attempted to create. The competing cultures within the Raider Regiment created practical problems for Marine Corps logistics and command structure. Supply officers had to allocate resources between 2 battalions that had different operational concepts and therefore different equipment priorities. Carlson's 1st Battalion, emphasizing mobility and psychological warfare, required more communication equipment, more intelligence-gathering resources, and different ammunition allocations than a more conventionally structured force. The 2nd Battalion's more traditional approach to fire support meant it required greater artillery support and more standardized logistics chains. Personnel rotations became politically fraught, as Marines could request assignment to either battalion, and officers maneuvered to position themselves for career advancement within one command structure or the other. The apparent unity of the Raider Regiment masked an increasingly fractious internal competition. At the tactical level, both battalions remained professional and disciplined. At the institutional level, they were rivals competing for the same pool of command authority and strategic credibility. As news of the 1st Raider Battalion's experiences on Guadalcanal filtered back to headquarters and to the 2nd Battalion's training areas, the contrast between Carlson's vision and the emerging Raider orthodoxy became increasingly apparent. The 1st Battalion's casualty rate, the disease that decimated its ranks despite tactical success, and the evident toll that 3 weeks of continuous jungle operations imposed on even highly motivated men suggested that Raider tactics, while effective, were not a costless alternative to conventional warfare. The 2nd Battalion observed these lessons with interest, but drew different conclusions than Carlson's veterans. Rather than concluding that Raider operations required extraordinary levels of collective commitment to endure, some 2nd Battalion officers concluded that Raider operations simply needed better logistics, better medical support, and more emphasis on conventional fire support to reduce the cost. In other words, they believed that the Raider concept could be made safer and more efficient by making it less revolutionary and more conventionally military. The philosophical divergence between the 2 battalions deepened into a practical debate about how to conduct warfare in the Pacific Islands. By late 1942, 2 distinct Raider cultures had crystallized within the Marine Corps. Carlson's 1st Battalion remained committed to the egalitarian collective and the philosophical underpinnings that had created it, even as its ranks were depleted by combat and disease on Guadalcanal. The 2nd Battalion, operating with only surface similarity to the 1st, had evolved into something more recognizably conventional. Senior Marine Corps leadership found themselves with multiple options for how raider tactics should function. They could continue supporting Carlson's visionary experiment and accept the organizational friction and high casualty rates it entailed. Or they could allow the 2nd Battalion's more pragmatic approach to become the template for future raider operations, potentially institutionalizing raider warfare while taming it to fit within conventional military hierarchy. The question was not yet framed in exactly these terms, but the choice was being made through 1,000 small decisions about resource allocation, command authority, and operational assignments. The unified vision of the raider concept was fractured before either battalion had completed its first year of existence, broken into competing interpretations of what it meant to conduct special operations in the Pacific War. The emergence of the 2nd Battalion was therefore not simply the replication of a successful military unit, but rather the beginning of a fundamental dispute about the nature of raider warfare itself. Two organizations bearing the same designation and similar tactical specialties had evolved in distinctly different directions because they were led by different men with different philosophical commitments and operated within different institutional pressures. Carlson's 1st Battalion faced increasing skepticism from within the Marine Corps establishment, precisely because it refused to conform to conventional military hierarchy. The 2nd Battalion faced no such criticism because it had accepted conformity from the beginning, requiring only that it be faster and more aggressive than standard units. This created a paradox. The more faithful representation of Carlson's original vision was increasingly isolated, while a more diluted version that accepted conventional military structure was more easily integrated into institutional planning. Neither battalion could be claimed as a complete success or failure. Both were succeeding and failing simultaneously in different ways. The stage was being set for a confrontation between competing visions of modern warfare, a confrontation that would be resolved not through doctrinal debate, but through casualty rates and political pressure and the slow grinding of institutional preference toward what was convenient rather than what was revolutionary. By November 1943, the 2nd Raider Battalion stood at a crossroads. The unit had endured 16 months of Pacific warfare, from training camps in California to the grinding campaigns of the Solomon Islands. They had earned respect within Marine Corps circles for their mobility, their adaptability, and their willingness to absorb punishment without fracture. Yet success had brought them to the attention of High Command, and High Command had different ideas about how the raiders should be used. The 2nd Battalion was ordered to participate in Operation Galvanic, an assault on Tarawa Atoll in the Gilbert Islands. What awaited them was not a raiders' war, but a slogging match against concrete, firepower, and an enemy prepared to fight to extinction. Tarawa would become the turning point, not toward greater recognition of raider tactics, but toward their extinction. The Japanese had spent months converting Tarawa into a fortress. The atoll itself was small, barely 2 miles long and half a mile wide at its widest point. There was nowhere to maneuver, nowhere to flank, nowhere to employ the speed and deception that raiders lived by. The Japanese garrison, numbering roughly 4,500 men, had constructed a network of concrete bunkers, anti-tank obstacles, and interlocking fields of fire. The beach itself was ringed with obstacles designed to shred landing craft and trap men in the open. Tarawa represented a new kind of Pacific warfare, not jungle raids where small forces could dissolve into terrain, but island fortresses where every position had been prepared, every approach anticipated, every defender committed to fighting to death rather than surrender. The defenders had been told explicitly that American Marines fought according to established doctrine. that they would land on the reef and wade ashore in predictable waves, and that any marine who reached the beach would be cut down. The Japanese were right about the doctrine. They were preparing for exactly what would arrive. The 2nd Raider Battalion approached the island as part of a larger invasion force organized by Admiral Raymond Spruance. The operation involved multiple marine divisions, naval gunfire support that had been calculated for precision, and airstrikes designed to soften resistance before the first wave touched sand. The planning had been thorough, perhaps too thorough, trapped in assumptions about how amphibious warfare should unfold. The Marine commanders believed that naval bombardment would suppress Japanese fortifications, that preliminary airstrikes would destroy or demoralize the garrison, and that Marine riflemen, landing in disciplined waves, would overwhelm whatever remained. The 2nd Raider Battalion was not given special assignment or autonomy. They were treated as line infantry, assigned sectors of the beach, and ordered to advance on schedule like every other unit. To the battalion commander, the order was clear: land, move forward, suppress enemy fire, advance inland. To the raiders themselves, trained in flexibility and rapid assault, the rigidity felt wrong. But orders were orders, and the force was committed. The bombardment began on 20 November 1943, starting before dawn. Naval gunfire from cruisers and destroyers pounded the island for hours, churning sand and concrete into clouds of dust and smoke. The men of the 2nd Raider Battalion watched from transport ships, their landing craft circling offshore as the naval guns worked the beach and fortifications. Some men felt confidence watching the tonnage of metal descending on the island. Others, veterans of smaller operations where flexibility had saved them from prepared positions, felt apprehension. The air strikes followed, bombers and fighters sweeping low across the atoll, dropping ordnance on bunkers and gun positions. The sheer volume of firepower seemed impossible to survive. Senior commanders believed the island had been effectively neutralized. The raid could succeed if the raiders reached the beach quickly, secured positions inland, and prevented the garrison from consolidating. Nobody predicted what actually happened. The marine assault commenced with the first wave heading toward the beach around 0800 hours. The 2nd Raider Battalion, assigned to land in the 2nd and 3rd waves, watched from their transport ships as the initial Marines hit the reef and began wading toward shore. The water was shallow, too shallow for the landing craft to approach close to the beach. Men had to wade several hundred yards in waist-deep water, exposed and moving slowly. The Japanese, sheltered in concrete bunkers that the naval bombardment had failed to destroy, waited until the Marines were fully committed to the wade ashore, then opened fire with machine guns, rifles, and artillery. The first waves became killing zones. Men fell into the shallow water, turned pink with blood, and floated backward on the tide. The naval bombardment had not destroyed the Japanese defenses. It had driven them underground, and when the Marines appeared, the bunkers rose up with their guns ready. The order to press forward still applied. The first waves had to advance or die, and they advanced. When the order came for the 2nd Raider Battalion to land, the beach was already chaos. The initial waves had achieved a foothold, but were pinned behind whatever cover they could find. A seawall, rubble from destroyed buildings, shallow shell craters that offered no real protection. The water from reef to shore was churned with smoke and blood. The raiders moved toward their landing craft, knowing they were walking into a meat grinder. The philosophy that had guided raider operations, speed, adaptability, mobility, had no application on Tarawa. There was no speed when you had to wade hundreds of yards through shallow water. There was no adaptability when every sector was assigned and accounted for. There was no mobility when the terrain was flat and open and covered with fire from multiple directions. The raiders moved anyway, because that was what soldiers did. They followed orders into conditions no training had prepared them for. The landing craft discharged them into the shallow water, and they began the slow, agonizing wade toward the beach. The first men to touch sand were met with machine gun fire that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Concrete bunkers, barely visible after the bombardment, sprouted guns that cut down Marines like scythes through wheat. Men tried to advance by running in short bursts, throwing themselves flat, crawling forward in inches. The Japanese had prepared interlocking fields of fire. If one bunker was pinned down, another would rake the advancing line. The raiders, accustomed to lightning strikes on small objectives where surprise was the armor, found themselves in trench warfare of the sort their grandfathers might have experienced in France in 1918. But the trenches were on the other side, and the Marines had to cross open ground to reach them. Men carried rifles, ammunition, and the weight of expecting to survive. Not all of them did. The casualty rate climbed with each successive wave. By midday, the 2nd Raider Battalion had suffered more than 200 casualties, killed, wounded, or missing. They had advanced perhaps 300 meters inland, and they were still in open terrain, still exposed to fire from positions that seemed impossible to suppress or destroy. By afternoon, the Marines had established a fragile perimeter on the western end of the island. The raiders, mixed with other Marine units, dug in using shell craters and the rubble of concrete structures. The Japanese counterattacked repeatedly, driving waves of troops across the narrow island toward Marine positions. Each counterattack was met with defensive fire, pushed back, and followed by Japanese withdrawal to prepare another assault. The fighting descended into pure attrition. Raiders and Japanese soldiers trying to kill each other with rifles, grenades, and bayonets in close quarters. This was not the psychological warfare that Carlson had pioneered, not the rapid strikes designed to break enemy morale through surprise. This was industrial slaughter where the side with more ammunition and more men willing to die would eventually prevail. The raiders died along with every other Marine on Tarawa, their training in rapid assault offering no advantage when the objective was to hold ground against human waves and return fire with overwhelming accuracy. The second day brought no relief. The Japanese, fighting from prepared positions with supplies stockpiled in underground caverns, showed no signs of surrender or demoralization. The Marines pushed forward incrementally, clearing bunkers one at a time through direct assault or grenades or flamethrowers. Each bunker that fell came at cost. Casualties sustained by Marines trying to suppress the garrison long enough for assault teams to approach close enough to kill the occupants. The raiders participated in these grim calculations like every other Marine unit. They moved forward when ordered, they returned fire, they suffered wounded and dead, and they did not retreat. By the second night, the 2nd Raider Battalion had sustained more than 350 casualties out of roughly 800 men who had landed. Nearly half the unit was gone. The battalion commander, assessing the situation, realized that Tarawa was not a raider operation anymore. It was a war of attrition, and the raiders had been fed into it like fuel into a furnace. The battle continued for 3 more days. By the time the Japanese garrison was eliminated or forced to retreat, more than 1,000 Marines were dead and more than 2,000 wounded. The 2nd Raider Battalion's losses were proportionate to the whole. Men killed trying to suppress bunkers, men wounded by machine gun fire, men who simply did not survive the kind of sustained combat that raider training had never prepared them to endure. The island was taken. The American flag was raised. The operation was declared successful. Yet the cost in casualties raised uncomfortable questions within Marine Corps Command. The assault had required sustained frontal warfare against prepared positions. Raiders were not better or worse at this kind of fighting than any other Marine infantry. The specialized training in rapid assault, deception, and mobility had offered no advantage. If anything, the psychological orientation toward lightning strikes and calculated aggression made the grinding defensive struggles of Tarawa psychologically harder to endure. The survivors of the 2nd Raider Battalion were withdrawn from combat for medical attention and casualty replacement. As the regiment reconstituted, debriefs and after-action reports circulated through command channels. Senior officers began asking whether the Raider battalions justified their existence. The units had proven they could fight as hard as any conventional Marine unit, but no harder. They had not achieved some breakthrough in amphibious warfare or discovered tactical innovations that gave them advantage in this new kind of fighting. The logistical burden of maintaining separate Raider units, with different training protocols and different command structures, suddenly seemed wasteful. If Raiders could be used as line infantry, why not simply maintain conventional Marine divisions? The philosophical arguments for Raider doctrine, mobility, deception, psychological warfare, began to sound like arguments against what modern amphibious assault had become. Tarawa had answered a question that nobody wanted answered, that the future of Pacific warfare would not be small, fast, clever operations, but large, brutal, sustained assaults against fortified positions. The Raiders, born from Carlson's belief that speed and innovation could overcome firepower, had met their match in Japanese concrete and American strategy that demanded more meat and more blood. Within weeks of Tarawa, the decision began circulating through the bureaucracy. The Raider battalions would be disbanded. The 2nd Battalion, along with the remnants of Carlson's 1st Battalion, would be absorbed into conventional Marine regiments. The specialized units that had trained together for months, that had developed their own culture and their own way of fighting, would be dissolved. The men would remain Marines and they would continue to fight, but the institution that had sheltered their experimental approach would cease to exist. Carlson, now promoted to general, received word of the decision as his health continued to decline. He had poured his philosophy into these men, had fought against the conservative establishment to keep the Raiders autonomous, and had watched them prove their worth in smaller operations. Tarawa was not a failure of Raiders. It was a revelation that the war had moved beyond Raider tactics. The island fortress required infantry assaults that valued bodies and firepower more than agility and insight. The very progress of American military technology, the ability to project force across the Pacific, had rendered Carlson's innovations suddenly obsolete. The disbandment of the Raider battalions in April 1944 was both quiet and complete. No ceremony marked the end of the experiment. No formal recognition acknowledged what the Raiders had attempted or achieved. Men were reassigned to other units. Promotions were distributed, and the distinctive Raider culture that had developed over 20 months of combat began to dissolve. Veterans would carry their Raider training into other operations, at Saipan, at Iwo Jima, at Okinawa, but they would carry it as individuals, not as part of an institution. The breaking point at Tarawa had not destroyed the Raiders physically, but it had destroyed their reason for being. They had demonstrated that they were no better and no worse than conventional Marines at the kind of warfare that the Pacific had become. That demonstration, paradoxically, ensured their obsolescence. Carlson's vision of a new kind of military force, mobile and psychological and built on collective discipline, had collided with the hard reality of island warfare in the age of concrete and machine guns. The result was not triumph or failure, but erasure, the dissolution of the experiment into the machinery of industrial warfare. The landing craft churned toward the reef at Tarawa Atoll on the 20th of November 1943. Men crowded shoulder to shoulder, weapons held across their chests, sweat mixing with sea spray in the tropical heat. These were the 2nd Raider Battalion, along with conventional Marine regiments, converging on an atoll that the Naval Command believed would fall in hours. Intelligence estimates suggested the Japanese garrison numbered fewer than 3,000 troops. What the planners had not fully grasped was that Tarawa's tiny coral islands had been converted into a fortress of concrete, anti-tank obstacles, and interlocking machine gun positions designed to make landing craft into floating coffins. The tide was low, lower than predicted, and the lagoon became a graveyard of metal and bodies before the first wave even reached the beach. Marines waded through water waist-deep, chests exposed, moving in formations that offered no protection against the firestorm descending from the shore. The raiders who struck Tarawa had been trained for something entirely different from what awaited them. Their doctrine centered on speed, deception, and rapid exploitation of chaos. Hit hard, confuse the enemy, withdraw before defenses could consolidate. They were instruments of psychological shock, designed to penetrate small garrisons, gather intelligence, destroy specific targets, and vanish. The Raider philosophy held that prolonged firefights favored the defending force, and that time was the enemy of the mobile warrior. Conventional military wisdom, by contrast, taught that you committed forces to an objective and held it, grinding through resistance with attrition and superior firepower. Tarawa required the second approach, and the raiders found themselves pressed into service as ordinary assault troops. Their specialized training in hand-to-hand combat, silent infiltration, and individual initiative meant almost nothing in the context of a reinforced defensive position anchored in concrete bunkers. The tactical environment had shifted fundamentally, and the innovation that had made the raiders distinctive became irrelevant in the face of disciplined machine gun fire. The battle raged for 4 days, the death toll mounted with mechanical inevitability. Estimates placed American casualties at more than 3,000, with more than 1,000 killed in action or died of wounds. The 2nd Raider Battalion absorbed losses consistent with the overall campaign, not spared by their training, not saved by their flexibility. Photography from Tarawa showed something the military establishment could not ignore. Bodies floating in the lagoon, Marines pinned behind minimal cover, returning fire at enemies they could not see. Commanders directing traffic on beaches that had become processing centers for wounded and dead. The images were stark, unambiguous, and they raised a question that echoed through the Pentagon and the Marine barracks at Quantico. Had the raiders' specialized methods been worth the cost? More precisely, if elite training and unconventional tactics could not reduce casualties in a major island assault, what value did they actually possess? The burden of proof shifted, where Carlson had argued that innovation saved lives through superior strategy. The Marine Corps leadership increasingly viewed the raiders as simply another combat unit, capable but not exceptional, and far from invulnerable. Behind the tactical failure lay a deeper institutional anxiety. The raiders, since their inception, had operated outside conventional hierarchy and command structure. They answered directly to Carlson and to Washington, not to theater commanders. They followed different training protocols, adopted different organizational principles, and, perhaps most troubling to career officers, they succeeded in ways that made conventional doctrine appear primitive. The success at Makin, despite its complications and cost, had generated credibility. Raider officers published articles in professional journals, Officers like James Roosevelt, despite his political connections, had earned respect through combat effectiveness. The very existence of the raiders challenged the Marine Corps' institutional assumption that traditional hierarchy, standardized training, and proven methods were sufficient. Tarawa represented an opportunity for the military establishment to reassert its authority over experimental units and to reject, implicitly and explicitly, the notion that the institution needed to be reformed. If the raiders could bleed and die like ordinary Marines, then they had no special claim on resources or independence. General Holland Smith, who commanded the assault on Tarawa, was not a raider sympathizer. He viewed the 2nd Raider Battalion as one component of a larger force and deployed them accordingly, not as a strike unit, but as part of the conventional assault. His after-action reports emphasized the Marines' courage and the enemy's fanatical defense. They did not celebrate the raiders' tactical innovation or suggest that raider methods had contributed to success. The Marine Corps Commandant, General Alexander Vandergrift, began receiving competing narratives about the raiders' value. On one side stood Carlson and his allies, arguing that the raiders represented the future of warfare and that their dismantling would constitute a betrayal of professional military thought. On the other side stood conventional commanders who viewed the raiders as a distraction, an expense, and a source of disruption within the service. The tension was not resolved through doctrinal debate, but through institutional pressure and bureaucratic attrition. What observers across the military had failed to fully appreciate was that Tarawa fundamentally altered the nature of Pacific warfare. The assault revealed that the Japanese had learned from earlier raider campaigns and smaller island defenses. They had adapted by concentrating forces, fortifying positions, and preparing to absorb American firepower. The tide of innovation in Japanese defensive strategy had risen. By 1943, Japanese commanders understood that rapid extraction was the raiders' escape valve, and they prepared defenses designed to pin American forces in place and bleed them through sustained combat. The environment for which the raiders had been trained was disappearing. Small, isolated garrisons were giving way to consolidated defensive positions. Surprise landings were becoming rarer as American air superiority and naval intelligence improved. The operational conditions that had made Makin possible, a small, inadequately defended atoll, rapid surprise, clear extraction routes, were becoming historically contingent rather than representative of future campaigns. In other words, the raiders had trained for a type of warfare that was becoming obsolete precisely because they had so effectively demonstrated its potential. The political and ideological dimensions of the debate about the raiders intensified after Tarawa. Carlson's left-leaning political views were well known within military circles. His adoption of collective decision-making protocols, his writings about the philosophical foundations of morale, and his willingness to cite Chinese communist military theory as inspiration had made him, in some quarters, a figure of suspicion. The post-war world was taking shape during the final years of the Pacific Campaign. Officers who had tolerated Carlson's unconventional methods as potentially useful wartime innovations were reconsidering as victory appeared inevitable. Why maintain an experimental unit run by a politically questionable officer when the conventional services were functioning adequately? Why continue to fund research into organizational methods that challenged established hierarchy? The question of military efficiency was inseparable from the question of ideological alignment. In the climate of bureaucratic warfare that characterized the Marine Corps, these considerations were rarely made explicit. Instead, they manifested as doubts about cost-effectiveness and questions about whether the raiders had truly demonstrated unique military value. The 2nd Raider Battalion's experience after Tarawa reflected the broader institutional skepticism. They were deployed to Bougainville in late 1943, where they operated in integrated fashion with conventional Marine regiments. No longer did they function as autonomous strike forces. Instead, they were treated as additional rifle companies assigned to larger battalion and regimental operations. The psychological effect on the men was significant. The Raider identity, that sense of being selected, trained differently, operating under different assumptions about leadership and individual initiative, was gradually diluted. Carlson, now operating at the division and corps level rather than commanding his battalion, found his sphere of operational influence shrinking. He was consulted, but consultation is not command. He was respected for his expertise, but expertise does not protect institutional autonomy. The very structure that Carlson had built, the 1st Raider Battalion with its distinctive command culture, was being systematically dismantled, not through direct order, but through the gradual application of administrative pressure and reallocation of resources. Within Marine Corps headquarters, a consensus was forming. The Raiders had proven they could fight, which had never been in question. What remained unproven was whether they were worth maintaining as a separate force. Cost-benefit analyses produced by Marine Corps planners suggested that training specialized forces diverted resources from building larger conventional forces. If the same men, given the same weapons and support, could be deployed as ordinary Marines, then the specialized training was luxury rather than necessity. The argument overlooked the strategic value of Raider operations in the early Pacific campaign and the intelligence that had been gathered through their raids. It overlooked the psychological impact of Raider tactics on American morale and Japanese defensive calculations, but in the context of massive industrial warfare, where production of weapons and ammunition dwarfed all other military expenditures, specialized training seemed marginal by comparison. The logic was not unreasonable from a purely quantitative perspective, and it was practically irresistible from a bureaucratic one. Carlson was aware of these currents, though the full extent of institutional opposition did not become clear until decisions had already been made. He continued to advocate for the Raiders' retention and for broader military recognition of unconventional doctrine. His writings emphasized morale, unit cohesion, and the psychological factors that determined combat effectiveness. In professional military journals and in classified memoranda, he argued that the Raiders represented a model for future military organization: smaller units, more flexible command structures, greater emphasis on individual training and initiative. He was not arguing against discipline or hierarchy, but for a reconceptualization of how they functioned in modern warfare. The Marine Corps listened respectfully and then proceeded with planning for consolidation. By early 1944, the decision to disband the Raider battalions as distinct units was effectively made, though the formal announcement would not come until April of that year. The doctrine was being rejected not through explicit refutation, but through the simple exercise of administrative authority and institutional preference. The human dimension of this institutional conflict cannot be separated from its professional and strategic aspects. Officers and men who had experienced Raider training knew that something distinctive had been created. The collective decision-making protocols, the reduction of rank-based privilege, the emphasis on unit cohesion over personal advancement. These had generated a form of military culture that was radically different from conventional Marine practice. Veterans of the 1st Raider Battalion, including survivors of the grueling Guadalcanal operation and the costly Makin raid, had invested their belief and their bodies in this experiment. They had sacrificed for something they believed represented the future of warfare. The disbandment of the raiders was experienced by these men not as a rational administrative adjustment, but as institutional rejection and betrayal. The knowledge that the Marine Corps considered their sacrifice useful, but ultimately dispensable, carried psychological weight that transcended military hierarchy. As 1944 advanced, and the war in the Pacific shifted toward preparations for assaults on Saipan and ultimately Japan's home islands, the question of raider doctrine receded from immediate institutional attention. The raiders existed in a kind of administrative limbo, no longer autonomous, no longer a distinct command, but not yet formally eliminated. Veterans were scattered across Marine divisions that had no investment in raider training or raider culture. Carlson, promoted to Brigadier General, found his operational authority confined to observation and advisory roles. The structure that had contained his philosophy and his vision for military organization was being systematically deconstructed, piece by piece, through the machinery of military bureaucracy. What had seemed revolutionary at the moment of creation, the notion that Marines could be trained to think for themselves, that leadership could be collective rather than authoritarian, that innovation could enhance rather than undermine military effectiveness, was now treated as an interesting historical experiment with no bearing on future military organization. The war continued. The raiders, no longer raiders, would fight as Marines, which is to say they would fight as all Marines fought, within the structures and under the command of an institution that had decisively rejected their founders' vision. By the autumn of 1943, the strategic momentum in the Pacific had shifted. The United States Navy and Marine Corps, having absorbed the lessons of Guadalcanal and countless smaller engagements, had begun to understand that island hopping would not be a series of isolated raids, but a grinding campaign requiring sustained presence and overwhelming firepower. The Japanese, entrenched across the Solomon Islands and beyond, had learned to fortify their positions with concrete, artillery, and layered defensive networks. What had worked in the early raids, speed, surprise, psychological disruption, would face opponents who had adapted, hardened themselves, and prepared to absorb shock and casualties as the price of holding territory. The Marine Corps command structure, observing these developments with a mixture of pragmatism and institutional skepticism, began asking whether the raiders could function as anything other than small-scale strike forces. The answer to that question would determine not whether the raiders survived, but how and under what conditions they would be forced to evolve or dissolve. The northern Solomon Islands, particularly Bougainville, represented a new class of objective. Unlike Makin Atoll, which was small and could be isolated, Bougainville was a massive landmass with multiple Japanese garrison sites spread across difficult terrain. The Japanese had established airfields, supply depots, and interconnected defensive positions. Any American operation there would require not a lightning raid, but a sustained military presence, soldiers and Marines holding ground, defending against counterattack, and establishing a foothold from which future operations could be launched. This was not Carlson's environment. This was the environment that made conventional battalions necessary and small unit tactics subordinate to larger strategic requirement. The raiders would still operate at Bougainville, but they would do so as components of larger formations, committed to the slow grinding business of territorial conquest rather than the sharp puncture of the raid. When the raider battalions arrived in the Bougainville operation in late 1943, the operational structure differed radically from their autonomous status during the Guadalcanal campaign. They were no longer semi-independent forces answerable primarily to their own commanders and the task force leadership. Instead, they were distributed as specialized rifle companies and platoons attached to larger Marine regiments and Army units. The command relationships that had defined the raiders, the council meetings, the debate between officers and enlisted men, the collective decision-making, began to disappear. They were now subject to the conventional hierarchy, the standardized orders, the rigid communication protocols of large unit warfare. Carlson's innovations, which had seemed revolutionary and essential in 1942, suddenly appeared impractical in a war that demanded tens of thousands of men operating in coordinated fashion across an entire island or archipelago. The men who had trained for psychological warfare and rapid maneuver found themselves assigned to static defensive positions, consolidation operations, and the routine tasks of holding newly captured terrain. The experience was profoundly disorienting for the raiders. The unit cohesion that had been built through months of unconventional training and shared sacrifice began to fragment. When raiders operated as a battalion, they knew each other, trusted the judgment of their leaders, and understood the philosophy behind every order. Now, scattered across various regiments, they found themselves serving under officers who did not understand raider doctrine, who viewed the raiders themselves with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion, and who saw no practical reason to maintain their distinctive methods. Some conventional commanders actively resisted raider tactics, viewing them as a distraction from the systematic application of firepower and manpower that modern warfare demanded. The raiders, for their part, sensed that their purpose was being diluted, their expertise treated as a curiosity rather than an essential tool, their presence tolerated rather than valued. The operational demands of Bougainville itself further eroded the conditions that raider tactics required. The campaign involved establishing a perimeter, bringing in supply lines, constructing defensive works, and preparing for sustained Japanese counterattack. These tasks demanded conventional military organization, logistics, engineering, medical support, artillery placement. Raiders trained for speed and mobility found themselves increasingly involved in the unglamorous work of consolidation. They filled sandbags, laid barbed wire, carried ammunition to artillery positions, and stood watch in defensive lines. The very essence of raider doctrine, strike hard, achieve surprise, extract rapidly, was incompatible with the new operational reality. How could you execute a lightning raid when the objective was to hold ground indefinitely? How could you emphasize speed and psychological disruption when the enemy was already entrenched, already expecting attack, and the Americans' own numerical and firepower advantage made conventional assault feasible if costly? During the Bougainville operation, a critical schism became visible within the raider community itself. Carlson's 1st Raider Battalion, which had maintained the strongest attachment to his philosophical innovations and his unconventional approach to leadership, was beginning to fragment under the pressure of conventional warfare and conventional command structures. Officers who had believed in council-style decision-making and the erosion of rank barriers found themselves subordinate to regimental commanders who had no patience for debate or collective deliberation. Some raiders adapted, their ambitions and practical sense allowing them to function within conventional structures. Others resisted, viewing the transition as a betrayal of the principles that had made the raiders effective. Still others simply endured, neither adapting nor resisting, but moving through the motions of warfare with diminishing conviction. The 2nd Raider Battalion, which had never fully embraced Carlson's radical philosophy, adapted more readily to conventional deployment and conventional command. This divergence would have consequences for how each unit was perceived by Marine Corps leadership and how they would be treated during the organizational crisis that was approaching. The geographic and logistical realities of the northern Solomon Islands also worked against raider-style operations. Bougainville was large enough that the Japanese could withdraw into the interior, making rapid pursuit impossible. The jungle terrain that had challenged the raiders on Guadalcanal was present again, but now accompanied by additional difficulties: dense vegetation, river crossings, malaria and tropical disease running at epidemic levels, and the simple exhaustion that came from fighting in a climate that seemed designed to break human beings. Raids required rapid extraction, but Bougainville's size and the distance from American naval bases meant that rapid extraction was often impossible. If the raiders went into the interior to strike a Japanese position, they had to be capable of fighting their way back out or waiting for relief from conventional units. This dependency on larger forces further eroded their autonomy and their ability to execute operations according to raider doctrine. The concept of consolidation itself was foreign to everything the raiders had trained for and believed they should do. Consolidation meant establishing defensible lines, clearing supply routes, preparing for the long static phase of occupation that would follow initial assault. It meant transforming captured territory from enemy-held ground into American-controlled rear area. For an Army or Marine Corps planning the next amphibious operation, consolidation was essential. You could not launch the next raid or assault until the current objective was secure and functioning as a base. But for units like the Raiders, consolidation felt like stagnation. It meant that the qualities that had made them effective, speed, aggression, psychological intensity, were no longer in demand. It meant that a rifleman skilled in conventional marksmanship and explosive demolition might be more valuable than a man trained in the subtle arts of disruption and maneuver. It meant that the war was moving on, and the raiders were being left behind. As 1943 turned to 1944, the higher command structures of the Marine Corps and the Navy were arriving at a difficult institutional conclusion. The campaign in the Solomon Islands had demonstrated that sustained island hopping could be achieved without the specialized raider battalions. Conventional Marine regiments, properly supported by naval gunfire and air power, could assault entrenched positions, absorb casualties, and push forward. The raiders had proven that unconventional tactics could achieve surprise and disrupt Japanese command structure. But they had also proven expensive in terms of trained personnel and logistical support. For every successful raider operation, there was a cost: men killed or wounded, supplies consumed, time spent training highly skilled personnel for missions that conventional forces might accomplish through sheer application of overwhelming numbers and firepower. The integration of the raider battalions into conventional units represented more than a military reorganization. It reflected a strategic choice about how to wage the remaining war. The Marine Corps command structure, particularly after the carnage at Tarawa, had begun to conclude that the future operations, assaults on Saipan, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, and potentially Japan itself, would require massed formations of conventional Marines, not small elite units executing specialized missions. Tarawa had demonstrated that even massive firepower and willingness to absorb casualties could be expensive when assaulting prepared positions. What Tarawa had not suggested was that small raider-style operations could have prevented or reduced that cost. Instead, some commanders argued that what had been lacking at Tarawa was not special tactics, but better planning, better preliminary bombardment, and better coordination of assault waves. The raiders, in this view, had become a luxury the American military could no longer afford to maintain as an autonomous force. By late 1943, As the raider battalions continued their consolidation operations at Bougainville and in nearby islands, they were becoming increasingly aware that their distinctive identity was being systematically dissolved. The officers and men who had volunteered for Carlson's experimental force, who had endured the criticism and skepticism from conventional commanders, who had fought at Makin and survived the nightmare of Guadalcanal's rat run, these men were being absorbed into the grinding machinery of conventional warfare. Carlson himself, now a brigadier general, was removed from direct command of the raiders and assigned to other duties as an observer and occasional commander of task forces. His revolutionary vision for how Marines could wage war, small, mobile, psychologically sophisticated units operating with collective discipline rather than authoritarian command, was being set aside by an institution that had tolerated his experiment but had never fully embraced it. The conditions that had fostered raider tactics, limited objectives, the advantage of surprise, the expectation of rapid extraction, were disappearing as the war shifted towards sustained regional campaigns. Bougainville represented not the flowering of raider doctrine, but the beginning of its eclipse. The legacy of this transition was mixed and painful. For many raiders, the shift to conventional operations felt like a repudiation of their sacrifice and their principles. They had volunteered for something different, something harder, something that demanded both innovation and unconventional thinking. Now they were being asked to function as regular Marines, to follow orders without debate, to participate in the systematic grinding forward that characterized large unit warfare. Some found meaning in that larger mission. Others carried a sense of loss, a feeling that something important and experimental was being abandoned precisely when it was needed most. The consolidation phase at Bougainville marked the moment when the Marines Corps chose the certain path of conventional warfare over the uncertain promise of specialized tactics and autonomous command. That choice would shape the remaining operations in the Pacific and would influence the ultimate fate of the raider battalions themselves. By the spring of 1944, the Pacific War had transformed into something the Marines who stormed Makin in 1942 could scarcely have imagined. The war was no longer a desperate struggle for survival on isolated atolls. It had become a machinery of conquest, a grinding advance northward toward Japan itself, and in that machinery there was no longer room for Carlson's experiment. The institutional pressures that had always simmered beneath the surface of raider operations now came to a boiling point. In April of that year, the decision came down from Marine Corps headquarters. The raider battalions would be deactivated. The men would be redistributed. The philosophy would be absorbed into conventional doctrine, or forgotten entirely. The timing of the disbandment was not accidental. By early 1944, the 4th Marine Division had been activated and was preparing for what would become the assault on Saipan, an operation that promised to be larger and more complex than anything the Pacific Theater had yet witnessed. The raider battalions, once celebrated as the Corps' cutting edge, suddenly appeared to high command as redundant, undisciplined, and expensive. Their losses at Tarawa had been substantial. Their independent streak made them difficult to integrate into larger amphibious operations. They questioned orders in ways that troubled men who had spent their careers maintaining strict hierarchical control. To many officers in the Marine Corps hierarchy, the raiders represented a kind of philosophical insubordination wrapped in combat effectiveness. That insubordination, they believed, had to end. Carlson, who had risen to the rank of brigadier general by this point, was informed of the decision before it became official policy. The conversation was cordial on its surface, but underneath lay a verdict that could not be appealed. He had spent nearly 3 years building something revolutionary, a force that rejected the assumption that military discipline required the erasure of individual thought, that victory demanded unquestioning obedience, that rank should determine all aspects of human interaction. The gung-ho philosophy, borrowed from Chinese military tradition and adapted to American Marines, had created cohesion born from shared purpose rather than coercion. It had worked in the field. Men under Carlson's command fought with a kind of fervor that transcended the mechanical obedience of conventional units. Yet that very success had made him dangerous to an institution predicated on hierarchy and control. The disbandment order was framed in practical terms. The Marine Corps announced that raider tactics had become obsolete in the context of large-scale amphibious assaults. The operations that had defined the raiders, rapid strikes on lightly garrisoned islands, rapid withdrawal, minimal casualties measured against maximum disruption, belonged to an earlier phase of the war. Now, as American forces prepared to assault heavily fortified positions with thousands of troops, there was no operational role for small, autonomous strike forces. The infantry battalions being created for the 4th Marine Division needed standardized training, predictable command structures, and consistent tactical doctrine. The raiders, with their emphasis on improvisation and collective decision-making, represented everything the new warfare required them to abandon. Many of the men who had signed up for the raiders 4 years earlier received their reassignments with a sense of betrayal that cut deeper than any combat wound. They had volunteered for a unit that promised something different from the rigid conformity of the regular Marine Corps. They had endured Carlson's Spartan training, his insistence on physical and psychological limits being exceeded, his belief that every man, regardless of rank, had the capacity for independent thought and rapid decision-making. They had watched officers eat the same rations as enlisted men. They had participated in council meetings where their voices carried weight in tactical planning. They had believed they were part of something revolutionary. Now they were being told that revolution had no place in modern warfare. The redistribution happened in waves across late 1944 and into 1945. Veterans of Makin, Guadalcanal, and the Rat Run found themselves scattered across dozens of separate units. Men who had trained together, bled together, and developed an almost familial bond within their original companies were separated into different divisions, different regiments, sometimes different theatres. The 4th Marine Division absorbed many of the 1st Raider Battalion survivors, but they went in as individual replacements, not as cohesive units. Their distinctive training and philosophy dissolved into the statistical anonymity of larger formations. The 2nd Raider Battalion, which had operated with somewhat greater conformity to traditional doctrine, was also broken apart, its men distributed to fill gaps in the expanding Marine Corps structure. For Carlson himself, the institutional rejection was as much political as professional. Even as his raider battalions had been gaining combat reputation, whispers about his political views had been circulating through Marine Corps command. He had lectured on the virtues of collective decision-making. He had incorporated elements of Chinese communist military organization into his training methods. He had spoken with admiration about certain aspects of Soviet military coordination. These were not opinions that endeared him to an officer corps that was growing increasingly sensitive to the rise of Cold War ideology, even before the war in the Pacific had ended. The disbandment of the raiders could be justified on purely operational grounds, but everyone involved understood that Carlson's removal from operational command was also an ideological purge. Carlson accepted the decision with a dignity that his supporters found almost unbearable to witness. He had been promoted to brigadier general, a recognition of his rank but not his authority. He was reassigned to observer and liaison roles, positions that sidelined him from actual command while maintaining his commission and providing the pretense of respect. He continued to serve in the Pacific, witnessing the operations he could no longer shape. He watched from a distance as his philosophy was dismantled, as the units he had built were scattered, as the men he had trained were fed into the grinding machinery of conventional warfare. The official Marine Corps position was that he had served with distinction and had earned promotion. The unofficial position among those who understood institutional politics was that he had been neutralized. The ripple effects of the disbandment extended far beyond the immediate operational consequences. The Marines who had volunteered for the raiders carried their experience forward into the units that absorbed them, often with uncomfortable results. Men trained to question orders and participate in tactical decisions found themselves subject to officers who demanded unthinking obedience. Units created for rapid, flexible response found themselves committed to sustained, grinding campaigns where innovation meant nothing and only firepower mattered. Some of the former raiders adapted, others struggled. A few maintained contact with Carlson and continued to believe, even as the war ground toward its conclusion, that they had been part of something larger than themselves, something that the Marine Corps establishment could not acknowledge without admitting its own limitations. The disbandment was officially announced in April 1944, though the process of actually redistributing the men extended across many months. No grand ceremony marked the end of the raider battalions. There were no speeches about their accomplishments or their place in Marine Corps history. The organizational papers were filed, the unit's colors were retired, and the men received their new assignments. Most of them would go on to fight in the remaining campaigns of the Pacific War. Some would be killed at Saipan or Iwo Jima or Okinawa, their service to the raiders unmentioned in the casualty reports and memorial services. Others would survive and carry their memories and their grievances into the post-war era, where they would argue, sometimes bitterly, about whether the Marine Corps had made the right decision. The irony that haunted many veterans was profound and specific. The raiders had been created because conventional marine tactics were proving inadequate to the strategic challenges of island warfare. Carlson and Roosevelt had understood something that conventional commanders often missed, that mobility, psychological flexibility, and reduced reliance on supply lines could accomplish disproportionate results against an enemy that expected linear assault and attrition. Yet by the time the raider battalions had matured into genuinely innovative units, the war itself had evolved in directions that seemed to validate the very conventional approaches the raiders had been designed to circumvent. The assault on Tarawa had been a frontal assault into fortified positions, and it had been horrendously costly. The assaults on Saipan, Guam, and Iwo Jima would follow similar patterns: grinding, conventional warfare where innovation mattered less than sheer firepower and willingness to absorb casualties. What made the disbandment truly bitter was that it seemed to suggest the Marine Corps leadership had learned nothing from the raider experience. The philosophy behind raider tactics, that small, intelligent, flexible units operating with clear purpose and without unnecessary hierarchy could achieve results that larger conventional formations could not, would eventually become central to American military doctrine. Special Operations Command, created decades after the war, would essentially resurrect the principles Carlson had pioneered. Yet in 1944, that understanding lay in the future. The institution could not see what it was discarding. It only knew that the raiders represented a challenge to its authority, a philosophical assault on the certainties that had always defined military organization, and so it disbanded them, scattered them, absorbed them, and erased them from the official narrative of how the Marine Corps won the Pacific War. Carlson watched this happen with the clarity of a man who had always understood how institutions worked, but had believed that combat necessity and demonstrated effectiveness might somehow transcend institutional inertia. He had been wrong. The Marine Corps was not a meritocracy despite its claims. It was a hierarchy that could tolerate innovation only so long as innovation did not challenge the fundamental assumption that rank determined competence, that obedience was more important than intelligence, that the chain of command existed for purposes beyond military necessity. It existed to maintain power and control. The disbandment of the raiders was, in this sense, not a defeat in war, but a defeat within an institution that could not accommodate the idea that its own assumptions might be incomplete. By the spring of 1944, Colonel Evans Carlson had become a man caught between worlds. He had designed and commanded the most unconventional fighting force the Marine Corps had ever deployed. He had trained men to think for themselves, to debate strategy in democratic councils, to embrace a philosophy of collective discipline that contradicted everything the military establishment believed about hierarchy and obedience. He had proven that speed, deception, and psychological innovation could inflict damage on a fortified enemy. Yet the institution he served had begun to turn against him, not because his methods had failed, but because they had succeeded in a way that threatened the foundational assumptions of military command. The disbanding of the raider battalions was not simply a tactical reorganization, it was a repudiation, and Carlson, promoted to brigadier general in recognition of his service, found that rank offered no protection against the deeper currents of institutional skepticism that now moved beneath the surface of Marine Corps leadership. The controversy that shadowed Carlson had multiple sources, each feeding into the others like tributaries into a rising river. His unconventional training methods had attracted criticism from traditionalists who viewed the raiders as undisciplined adventurers rather than professional soldiers. Officers steeped in formal military science questioned whether councils and debates weakened command authority, or whether shared decision-making bred the kind of independent thinking that could lead to insubordination. More damaging still were the whispers about Carlson's political sympathies. He had spent years in China as a military observer before the war. He had studied Chinese military organization and embraced elements of collective philosophy that bore uncomfortable resemblance to communist doctrine. In an American military establishment increasingly wary of leftist influence, these associations became liabilities that grew heavier with each passing month. By 1944, Cold War paranoia had not yet crystallized into the rigid ideology that would dominate the 1950s, but the groundwork was being laid. Carlson's experimental philosophy looked less like bold innovation and more like dangerous heterodoxy. The decision to absorb the raiders into conventional regiments had shattered Carlson's command structure and scattered the men he had so carefully selected and trained. For a military leader, particularly one whose entire identity was bound up with the creation and direction of a specific unit, this dissolution amounted to professional obliteration. Carlson could not simply retire with honor, nor could he remain in the Pacific theater with his men, maintaining the collective organism he had built. Instead, he was reassigned to a series of observer and advisory roles, positions that emphasized his irrelevance while maintaining the appearance of continued service. He traveled between island bases, witnessing operations conducted by younger commanders who had inherited neither his philosophy nor his trust in raider doctrine. The men he had trained were fighting in distant sectors under officers who did not understand the principles upon which their training had been built. Carlson could watch, could advise, could document, but could not command. For a man whose entire adult life had been defined by the exercise of authority and the expression of original military thought, this constraint was its own form of combat. What made Carlson's twilight more bitter still was the unavoidable recognition that the institution had been partially justified in its skepticism. The raider operations, for all their tactical success, had produced casualty rates that were difficult to defend when measured against conventional operations. The 3-week rat run on Guadalcanal had destroyed the raiders' cohesion through disease and exhaustion at least as thoroughly as enemy action had. The assault on Makin, while nominally successful, had revealed logistical vulnerabilities that a more conventionally organized force might have managed more effectively. The bloodbath at Tarawa had demonstrated conclusively that raider tactics offered no advantage in large-scale assault operations against hardened positions. An institutional historian could examine the record and conclude that Carlson's innovations had produced results that justified neither the cost nor the doctrinal disruption they entailed. Carlson himself understood this calculus. Even if he could not fully accept it, he had staked his military reputation on the proposition that unconventional methods could reduce casualties and increase operational effectiveness. The statistics, examined coldly, suggested otherwise. The raiders had inflicted significant damage on Japanese forces, but they had also paid a terrible price for the privilege of doing so. The physical deterioration that accompanied Carlson's professional marginalization was neither incidental nor slow. Jungle warfare in the Pacific exacted a toll on the human body that official casualty statistics never captured. Carlson had spent months in conditions of extreme hardship, tropical heat, endemic disease, perpetual humidity that seemed to corrode equipment and flesh alike. Malaria, the curse of Pacific operations, had infected him repeatedly. The parasite does not kill directly but weakens, undermines, creates waves of fever and profound exhaustion that attack the will as thoroughly as they assault the body. By 1944, Carlson was in his mid-50s, an age when recovery from such assaults comes slower and less completely than it does for younger men. His energy, which had animated the raider battalions and driven the relentless operational tempo that had made them feared, began to ebb visibly. Officers who saw him during this period noted that he seemed diminished, not merely in authority, but in physical presence. The man who had marched with his raiders through jungle and had demanded impossible exertions from himself as well as his men was being consumed from within by the cumulative damage that such demand produces. Yet Carlson did not withdraw entirely from combat. He continued to participate in Pacific operations, though in diminished capacities. He served as an observer during major amphibious assaults, witnessing from rear positions operations that he could no longer lead from the front. This combination, reduced authority coupled with continued exposure to operational stress and difficult conditions, produced a peculiar form of torture. He retained enough responsibility to be drawn into the emotional and physical demands of combat, but not enough authority to shape decisions or protect the men who fell under his nominal command. He could see where tactics could be improved, where speed and innovation could reduce casualties, but he could not implement those improvements because the command structure had passed into other hands. His advice, when solicited, was received with polite attention and often disregarded. The experience of being a military professional without meaningful command authority is one that many officers throughout military history have endured. But for Carlson, it held particular sting because the authority that had been stripped from him had been so hard-won and so central to everything he believed about effective military organization. The political suspicions that had begun to accumulate around Carlson intensified during this period, feeding into the machinery of institutional rejection. Military intelligence services maintained files on officers whose political affiliations or philosophical sympathies were deemed questionable. Carlson's years in China, his study of communist military organization, his advocacy for collective decision-making processes that mimicked communist organizational doctrine, all of this went into those files. The fact that Carlson's interest in Chinese military methods predated any formal American hostility toward communism was irrelevant. What mattered was the appearance of ideological contamination. Carlson was not alone in this regard, but he was visible enough to be noticed. The top leadership of the Marine Corps had begun to view him as a liability, not merely because his methods had produced mixed results, but because his methods carried political implications that made him vulnerable in an increasingly security-conscious military establishment. The institutional machinery that would later consume many talented officers suspected of leftist sympathies was not yet at full throttle, but it was warming up, and Carlson was already in its sights. The isolation of Carlson's position was compounded by the fact that his vision for military innovation had been genuine and deeply held. He was not a careerist who could simply adapt to institutional rejection and find contentment in conventional command. He had believed in the philosophical and operational superiority of his methods. He had built the Raiders as an expression of that belief, and he had sacrificed much to prove that belief's validity. The disbanding of the Raider battalions and his subsequent marginalization were not merely professional disappointments. They were refutations of the core convictions around which he had organized his entire military existence. A man could survive institutional rejection if he believed the institution to be wrong. A man could persevere through personal adversity if he maintained faith in the significance of his work. But Carlson had to confront the possibility that perhaps the institution was right, that his innovations had been costly experiments that produced results inferior to conventional methods, and that his political and philosophical associations had rendered him too divisive a figure to maintain meaningful command authority. This reckoning was internal and largely unspoken, but it weighed on him with the weight of genuine crisis. The relationship between Carlson and the men he had trained grew increasingly complicated during this period. The Raiders, who had been disbanded and distributed into conventional units, looked to Carlson as their prophet and vindication. His marginalization struck many of them as a betrayal, not by Carlson himself, but by an institution that did not deserve to command men of the caliber they represented. They had absorbed his philosophy of collective discipline and shared purpose, and they experienced his sidelining as confirmation that military institutions were fundamentally hostile to innovation, individual initiative, and genuine human dignity. Yet Carlson could not fully embrace this narrative of vindication. He understood, more clearly perhaps than his former men could, that the institution's rejection of him had partial justification. The Raiders had performed extraordinary feats, but they had also accumulated casualties at rates that demanded explanation. The psychological cohesion he had built had dissolved under the pressures of sustained warfare and disease. The experimental methods that had worked brilliantly in small unit operations had proven inadequate when scaled to larger formations and different tactical environments. Carlson had to live with the knowledge that his vision had been both vindicated and refuted simultaneously, that history would probably render judgment on him that was mixed and unsatisfying to those who had believed most deeply in his methods. Throughout 1944 and into 1945, Carlson occupied a kind of professional purgatory. He held the rank of brigadier general, which conferred status and respect in theory, but he commanded no major operations and wielded influence over no significant decisions. He participated in planning sessions where his voice was tolerated but not heeded. He witnessed operations from positions that allowed observation but not intervention. He was consulted on matters of raider doctrine and unconventional warfare, even as the institutional apparatus was systematically dismantling everything he had built in those fields. He received decorations and commendations for his service, recognition that was simultaneously genuine and hollow. Genuine in that it acknowledged his undeniable accomplishments, hollow in that it was offered while he was being rendered operationally irrelevant. The Marine Corps had found the formula for dealing with inconvenient innovators: honor them sufficiently to avoid appearance of persecution, but marginalize them thoroughly enough to ensure their ideas do not threaten established hierarchies. The war's progression toward its conclusion offered no relief from Carlson's twilight condition. As American forces pushed closer to Japan itself, as the scale of operations increased and the brutality intensified, the need for unconventional tactics should theoretically have increased. Japanese forces, facing overwhelming material superiority and territory that was rapidly being reduced, might have been expected to employ more guerrilla and small unit tactics that could benefit from raider doctrine. Instead, the massive assaults on Iwo Jima and Okinawa proceeded along conventional lines, with overwhelming firepower and sustained operations designed to destroy Japanese forces through attrition rather than maneuver and deception. Carlson could see, perhaps more clearly than most, that the tactical environment in the Pacific was evolving in directions that his methods were poorly suited to address. But he could not say so with authority, because authority had been stripped from him. He could only watch as battles unfolded according to plans that he had no role in shaping, fought by men trained in doctrines that had superseded everything he believed about effective warfare. By 1945, when Japan surrendered in August, Carlson had become an historical figure while still alive, a man whose significance was already being written into the past tense by historians and military analysts who were assessing what the raider experiment had ultimately meant. The Marine Corps had moved on. The institution had absorbed the lessons it wished to learn from raider operations and discarded the rest. Carlson remained in the military, but he was a relic of an experiment that had been terminated, a keeper of doctrinal flames that no longer burned brightly in the institutional consciousness. The war that had given him prominence and authority had ended with him standing at the margins, watching younger officers receive commendations and commands that Carlson had once expected would be his. The cancer that would eventually consume him was not yet visible, but the deterioration was plain to those who had known him before the war, before the raiders, before the burden of innovation and institutional rejection had carved lines into his face and hollowed the force from his movements. Carlson's twilight was not a gradual fade but a sudden eclipse, the moment when the light that had defined him was cut off by the body of the institution he had served, leaving him to spend the final years of his life in shadow, remembered by those who loved him and largely forgotten by the institution that had briefly elevated him before deciding he was too dangerous to trust with meaningful command. In April of 1944, the Marine Corps made its decision final. The Raider battalions, which had operated as autonomous fighting units for nearly 2 years, ceased to exist as distinct organizations. The men who had volunteered for Carlson's experiment, who had endured the rat run across Guadalcanal and absorbed the chaos of Makin Atoll, were scattered across the Pacific like sand caught in a receding tide. Some went to the 4th Marine Division, others were parceled out to the 5th Marine Division, the 2nd Division, units being assembled for what everyone understood would be the next phase of the island campaign. The men arrived at their new assignments carrying with them not just their weapons and field packs, but an entire philosophy of warfare that their new commanders did not understand and largely did not want. They were no longer raiders. They were now simply Marines, indistinguishable in uniform and designation from the thousands of others streaming through the training camps and staging areas in the Pacific. What had made them distinctive, what had set them apart through months of experimental training and brutal combat, was being methodically erased. 2 months later, in June of 1944, these dispersed veterans found themselves wading ashore on Saipan. The island lay in the Mariana Archipelago, roughly 1,500 kilometers from the Japanese home islands, and it represented something entirely new in the Pacific War. Not a raid, not a lightning strike followed by extraction, but a massive, sustained amphibious assault designed to establish a permanent foothold in territory from which American bombers could reach the Japanese mainland. Approximately 80,000 Marines and soldiers would assault the island. The Japanese garrison, numbering perhaps 50,000 troops, was dug into fortified positions with artillery, machine guns, and defensive works that had taken months to prepare. There was no deception possible here, no speed that could overcome the mathematics of firepower. This would be a war of grinding attrition, of systematic destruction, of patience and overwhelming force. The raider veterans who stepped off the landing craft and into the shallow water recognized immediately that everything they had been trained to do, everything that had defined their identity as raiders, was utterly irrelevant to what was about to happen. The first days on Saipan were chaos and confusion, though of a different character than the controlled aggression the raiders had practiced. Japanese artillery and small arms fire poured down from the heights overlooking the beaches. Men died trying to advance beyond the shoreline. The terrain was broken and dense with vegetation, but unlike the jungle raids on Guadalcanal, there was no element of surprise available to those who moved with cunning and speed. The Japanese defenders were not scattered, not vulnerable to psychological pressure or infiltration. They were in fortified positions, prepared to defend to the last man, and they had the firepower to make that defense horrifically expensive for anyone who approached. The raider veterans found themselves compressed into units of company strength and battalion strength, advancing on orders from division commanders they had never met, executing plans they had not helped devise, following tactics that bore no resemblance to the flexible, adaptive warfare they had trained for under Carlson's command. This dissolution of identity happened not through dramatic gesture or formal ceremony, but through the mundane mechanics of military administration. A raider sergeant arrived at his new battalion with orders assigning him to a rifle company. The captain commanding that company had no knowledge of what a raider was. He had perhaps heard rumors of an elite force, possibly thought of them as showboat adventurers, more concerned with propaganda than proper soldiering. The sergeant was issued a position in the squad structure identical to any other non-commissioned officer and told to execute his duties. There was no time for explanation, no space for him to explain that the raider philosophy emphasized collective decision-making, or that he was accustomed to understanding the strategic purpose of every operation, or that the chain of command he had known was built on merit rather than strict hierarchy. He was now part of a machine, and the machine operated according to rules written decades before he had been born. The collective spirit that had been so carefully cultivated at Camp Lejeune, the sense of shared purpose that had sustained the 1st Battalion through the Rat Run and the 2nd Battalion through all its earlier operations, could not survive the systematic division of the force across dozens of separate commands. The assault on Saipan developed into exactly the kind of warfare the raider doctrine had been designed to avoid. American forces pushed inland against prepared defensive positions, taking and giving casualties in the grinding, brutal pattern of conventional warfare. There were no opportunities for flanking maneuvers that could be executed in a matter of hours. There were no opportunities for small teams to infiltrate Japanese lines and sow confusion. The battlefield was dominated by artillery, by direct fire from machine gun positions, by the sheer concentration of men and firepower committed to pushing back an entrenched enemy. The Raider veterans, scattered throughout various battalions and companies, had to operate according to the same tactics being employed by every other rifleman on the island. Move when ordered, take cover when directed, suppress enemy positions with supporting fire, wait for the next phase of the advance. The uniqueness they had cultivated, the distinctive competence that had made them valuable, became not just irrelevant but actually invisible. They were no longer raiders in anything but their own memory. Some of the officers who had been part of the raider structure, those who had risen to company or platoon command before the reorganization, tried to maintain elements of the old philosophy even within their new assignments. They ate with their men. They consulted them on tactical problems. They pushed back against orders they thought were wasteful or poorly conceived. Some of them were eventually relieved of command for being insufficiently compliant with the rigid hierarchy of conventional warfare. The Marine Corps was not interested in modification or gradual integration of raider methods. The decision to disband the units had been made from above, and it was being implemented with institutional efficiency. Officers who questioned it or tried to preserve its methods were viewed as insubordinate, as potentially destabilizing influences on the authority structure that held an amphibious army together. The experiment was over. Conformity was the requirement, and those who could not conform were removed. The human cost of this transition became evident as the campaign progressed. Men who had been trained to solve problems through speed and unconventional thinking found themselves in situations where the only solution available was to advance against prepared positions at whatever cost was necessary. The casualty rate on Saipan was extraordinary. Roughly 3,500 American service members were killed and another 8,000 wounded in a campaign that lasted 3 weeks. Among them were raider veterans whose particular skills and training had been rendered obsolete by the environment in which they were now fighting. Some died doing exactly what they had been trained to do before the reorganization, but in a context where such methods could not save them. Others died following orders that violated every principle Carlson had taught them about preserving the lives of men under their command. The irony was bitter and inescapable. The Marines had discarded the distinctive force before it could be properly tested in the environment for which it had been designed. Now the men who comprised it were simply dying like all the other Marines on Saipan, and their deaths added nothing distinctive to the historical record. The dispersion of the raider force across multiple divisions meant that no unit commander had a comprehensive view of how many former raiders were serving under him. The distinctive culture that had defined the force could not reassert itself because there was no critical mass of shared experience or training anywhere on the island. A handful of raiders might serve in one company, a few more might be in the company next door, but the company commander would have no way of knowing this. Even if he did, he would have no basis for treating them differently or organizing them according to any principle other than the standard Marine Corps structure. The collective memory of what the raiders had been, of what they had tried to accomplish, shattered into individual, isolated fragments. Each man carried it alone in his mind. When men from different raider units did encounter each other, they recognized each other by small signs and gestures, shared references to places like Makin and Guadalcanal, understood that they had been part of something that was now being deliberately erased. Some found solace in this secret knowledge. Others found only bitterness. By the time Saipan was secured in late June of 1944, the Raider experiment had been dead for more than 2 months. The assault on the island represented not the cutting edge of American combat innovation, but rather the retreat of that innovation in favor of conventional mass warfare. The strategic achievement of securing Saipan and establishing air bases from which American bombers could reach Japan was genuine. The tactical sacrifice required to achieve it was also genuine. But that sacrifice included not just the lives of the 28,000 Japanese soldiers and civilians who died on the island, but also the deliberate dissolution of a military force that might have offered an alternative to the grinding attrition that would characterize the next stages of the Pacific War. The men who had volunteered for the Raiders, who had endured Carlson's strange experimental philosophy, who had learned to move through darkness and solve problems through cunning rather than firepower, were now simply absorbed into the conventional warfare machine. Their distinctive training and philosophy remained locked in their individual memories, invisible to the command structure, irrelevant to the orders they received, powerless to influence the tactics they were forced to execute. The psychological impact of this dispersal and integration was different for each man, but uniformly corrosive to morale and sense of purpose. Some of the Raider veterans were young enough and experienced enough to adapt successfully to conventional marine warfare. They understood the necessity of hierarchy and discipline, and they executed their duties with competence, even if not with the sense of shared mission they had known before. Others struggled visibly with the transition. They questioned orders that seemed wasteful. They advocated for tactics they had learned to use in Raider operations. They were seen by their commanders as troublemakers or as men who could not adjust to the realities of modern combat. A few were eventually killed, their final moments coming not in the context of innovative operation, but as simple casualties of grinding warfare. The coherence that had existed within the Raider force, the sense that each man understood his role and the purpose of his sacrifice, was replaced by the atomization of the conventional military structure. They were no longer part of an experiment. They were simply Marines, and Marines died at Saipan in enormous numbers, their deaths indistinguishable from the deaths of any other men who fought on that island, or would fight on islands yet to come. What had been lost was not simply an organizational structure or a tactical doctrine. What had been lost was a particular way of thinking about warfare and about the human beings who fought it. Under Carlson's command, at least in theory, every man understood why he was fighting. Every decision was explained and debated. Every operation had a clear purpose beyond the simple destruction of the enemy. When that force was disbanded and its members scattered, what was lost was the possibility that this alternative vision might prove itself superior to conventional warfare. The subsequent campaign on Saipan was no less heroic and no less terrible than the campaigns that preceded it. The Marines who fought there, including the Raider veterans, distributed anonymously among the various units, demonstrated the same courage and endurance that had characterized the Corps from its founding. But what they demonstrated was the courage of men following orders they did not understand, pursuing objectives they had not helped formulate, dying in patterns established by commanders and planners who had never served in the experimental battalions and never wanted to. The Raider philosophy was not defeated in combat. It was simply discarded before it could prove itself. The veterans of Saipan and the Raider operations that preceded it would carry the knowledge of what might have been, and that knowledge would be more painful than any ordinary combat wound. By the time Saipan fell to American forces, the transition was complete. The Raider era was not ending. It had ended. The men who had been part of it were now indistinguishable from the rest of the Marine Corps, except for the internal knowledge they carried. the memories they harbored, the sense that they had been part of something significant that the institution had deemed unworthy of preservation. Some would survive the rest of the war. Others would die on Saipan or on islands yet to come. Their deaths would be recorded in casualty lists, but the distinctive quality of their training and experience would not be noted. The Marine Corps had chosen conformity over experimentation, mass over innovation, the proven methods of industrial warfare over the uncertain potential of adaptive, flexible tactics. Whether that choice was right or wrong, whether the casualties on Saipan might have been reduced by tactics that the raiders might have employed, these were questions that would never be answered. The institution had made its decision, and the men were simply required to execute it. The island of Iwo Jima rises from the Pacific Ocean like a monument to destruction. Volcanic, barren, and utterly devoid of shelter, it sits roughly 700 kilometers south of Tokyo, a sulfurous rock that had been fortified by the Japanese military into one of the most meticulously prepared defensive positions in human history. When the Marines approached in the pre-dawn darkness of the 19th of February 1945, they carried with them all the accumulated experience of the Pacific War, and none of it would matter. The former raiders, scattered across multiple divisions and regiments, found themselves part of an amphibious assault designed not around their principles of speed and maneuver, but around something far more brutal: the industrial annihilation of an entrenched enemy through sustained, methodical violence. The operation had been planned with precision and desperation. Intelligence officers calculated that the island's network of caves, tunnels, and underground fortifications held approximately 20,000 Japanese defenders. The beach itself was black sand, volcanic and treacherous, offering no natural cover and no advantage to men trained in infiltration and psychological warfare. The Marines would land in waves, advance inland through killing zones, and eventually seize the island's high ground, Mount Suribachi, and the critical Japanese airfields that dotted the plateau beyond. For the raiders who had trained in the art of rapid strikes and psychological pressure, this was not their kind of war. This was attrition, this was mathematics, and the mathematicians had already calculated the cost in advance. The men who stormed ashore on that 19th of February were different from the elite volunteers who had struck Makin 3 years earlier. The raiders, as a distinct organization, had ceased to exist for nearly a year and a half. The survivors of the Guadalcanal campaigns, the veterans of Bougainville and the Northern Solomons, were now distributed across the 4th Marine Division, the 5th Marine Division, and other conventional regiments. They carried with them the ghost of Carlson's philosophy, that collective discipline, psychological resilience, and unconventional thinking could triumph over numerical disadvantage. But they carried it as individuals, not as a unified force. Some officers still remembered the council-style decision-making. Some enlisted men still spoke about the old raider way, but they were Marines first now, integrated into the conventional hierarchy that had always been skeptical of their methods. The beach conditions at Iwo Jima were catastrophic from the opening moments. The volcanic sand had the consistency of powdered ash, offering almost no traction. Vehicles bogged down instantly. Men sank to their ankles and knees with every step, burning their exposed skin in the process. The sand retained heat from the island's geothermal activity, and prolonged contact could cause severe abrasion and thermal injury. The former raiders, accustomed to moving quickly through terrain they had studied beforehand, found themselves trapped in a killing zone, with no room for the deception and maneuver that had defined their doctrine. The Japanese had prepared fields of interlocking fire that covered every inch of the approach. Machine gun bunkers, reinforced by years of construction and camouflage, opened fire with mechanical precision. Artillery, pre-positioned on every elevated feature, began pulverizing the beach. Mortar fire fell like rain. By midday, the beach was a graveyard. One former raider veteran later described the sensation of landing at Iwo Jima as stepping into a furnace. The heat from the sand, the percussion of artillery, and the psychological weight of knowing that every step forward might be the last, created a sensory experience that training could not mitigate. The speed that had defined raider tactics was irrelevant when movement itself became a death sentence. The psychological techniques that had worked at Makin, the shock of sudden appearance, the demonstration of unit cohesion and aggressive purpose, held no power over defenders who were fanatically committed to fortified positions and had no intention of retreating. The raiders had been trained to break the enemy's will through audacious action and controlled ferocity. They now faced an enemy whose will could only be broken by the complete physical annihilation of their combat capacity. The advance inland was measured not in kilometers but in individual yards, acquired through hours of sustained combat and measured in cascading casualties. The men who had practiced hand-to-hand combat in raider training found themselves instead manning flamethrowers, demolition charges, and providing suppressive fire for infantry attempting to clear fortified positions one bunker at a time. The operational environment resembled nothing so much as the positional warfare of the First World War, an echo of tactics that should have been obsolete by 1945, but persisted because the Japanese military had spent 3 years converting the island into a massive fortress. Former raiders worked as team leaders, squad sergeants, and fire team commanders, applying their accumulated combat experience to the brutal mathematics of clearing caves and bunkers. But their leadership, their training in rapid exploitation and psychological pressure could only accelerate the process marginally. The fundamental equation remained unchanged. Japanese soldiers would hold their positions until killed, or the position was overrun through superior firepower. The volcanic cone, roughly 170 meters high, was honeycombed with defensive positions. The Japanese had prepared fields of fire that converged on every approach route. Machine guns, artillery, and mortar teams had been positioned to create overlapping zones of destruction. Marines would advance, take casualties, consolidate positions, and advance again. Former raiders participated in this grinding advance, their specialized training now reduced to conventional infantry tactics, accelerated by their combat experience and psychological hardness. On the 4th day of the operation, elements reached the summit and raised an American flag, a moment that would be immortalized in one of the war's most iconic photographs. Yet the seizure of Suribachi did not end the fighting. It merely marked a transition point in the battle. The real test came afterward, as the Marines advanced northward across the island toward the plateau and the airfields beyond. The Japanese had prepared a secondary defensive line using terrain, cave systems, and prepared positions that made Suribachi appear almost elementary by comparison. Former raiders found themselves part of attack formations that had to close with enemy fortifications protected by natural and artificial obstacles. The speed that had characterized their training proved useless. The psychological resilience that Carlson had cultivated now served mainly to keep men functioning in conditions of extreme stress, exhaustion, and grief. The casualty rates were staggering. Men died in numbers that made even experienced combat veterans recoil. The island's small size meant that there was nowhere to rest, nowhere to recover, nowhere to escape the constant pressure of combat operations. The volcanic terrain provided no concealment, only the black and grey rock, still warm from geothermal activity, offering no solace. By the 23rd of February, the fourth day of combat, the casualties had reached levels that exceeded even the darkest projections. The former raiders, scattered across multiple divisions and increasingly fragmented by the constant churn of replacements and casualty evacuation, continued to function as combat marines, which is to say they continued to advance, continued to engage, and continued to suffer losses that seemed disproportionate to tactical gain. The innovations that Carlson had championed, collective decision-making, psychological preparation for high-intensity combat, unconventional thinking about warfare, these things could not protect men from machine gun fire, artillery shells, or the simple mathematics of infantry assaults against fortified positions. What they could do was provide a framework of meaning, a sense of collective purpose that transcended the immediate horror. But increasingly, even that framework was being challenged by the sheer physical and psychological weight of the operation. The month-long campaign to seize Iwo Jima cost the Marine Corps over 3,900 killed in action and more than 14,000 wounded. The Japanese lost nearly all of their defender force, approximately 20,000 men who died rather than surrender. For the former raiders, the specific numbers were harder to quantify. They were no longer organized as a distinct unit, so precise casualty counts by former raider status were not systematically recorded. But veterans would later recall the names of friends and officers who had served in the raider battalions. Men they knew had died on that volcanic island. Some had been killed on the beach during the initial assault. Others had been lost during the advance on Suribachi. Still more had died in the grinding positional warfare of the northern sector. The operation's tactical purpose was clear: the seizure of airfields that would allow American fighter planes to provide escort coverage for B-29 bombing raids on Japanese cities and military installations. From a strategic perspective, the operation made sense within the broader context of the island-hopping campaign. But for the men who fought there, Iwo Jima represented a complete negation of everything the raiders had attempted to achieve. There was no scope for rapid exploitation, no opportunity for psychological shock tactics, no chance to demonstrate the superiority of speed and maneuver over conventional assault. Instead, the island demanded exactly what the raiders had been designed to avoid: prolonged, sustained, frontally committed combat against fortified positions. It was a war that conventional Marine divisions might have fought just as effectively, perhaps more effectively, than the specialized operators who had been forced to shelve their innovations and conform to standard doctrine. The former raiders who survived Iwo Jima carried with them a profound sense of displacement. They had endured the campaign and had shown themselves capable of executing standard infantry tactics with competence and courage. But the operation had stripped away the context that had given their training and innovations meaning. At Makin, they had been raiders, strike specialists undertaking a mission that only their particular training and organization could accomplish. At Iwo Jima, they were simply Marines, indistinguishable from any other rifle squad or platoon moving through the volcanic debris. The fact that they survived, the fact that some were killed, all of it occurred within a massive, grinding operation that would have proceeded almost identically without them. Their collective philosophy, their psychological resilience, their innovation, these things had been rendered irrelevant by an operational environment designed specifically to negate their strengths and force them into conventional patterns of warfare. As the island was finally secured in early March, the survivors began the slow process of consolidation and reorganization. The Marine Corps had absorbed its losses, secured its objective, and prepared for the next operation in the sequence toward Japan itself. The former raiders, having proven themselves effective conventional Marines, received assignments for subsequent operations, and continued the war as integrated units. There would be no recognition of their distinctive role at Iwo Jima, no special commendation for having adapted from their specialized training to conventional requirements. They were simply Marines who had fought and survived. And yet, in that survival and that adaptation lay a truth that would shape how the Marines thought about unconventional warfare for generations to come. The gap between the ideal conditions required for innovative tactics and the messy reality of sustained combat operations could not be bridged by training, courage, or philosophical commitment alone. On Iwo Jima, the question of whether the raiders' methods could endure in large-scale warfare was definitively answered. They could not. Speed had no value on an island where every position was prepared. Deception held no power against an enemy committed to death rather than retreat. And psychological pressure meant nothing to men entrenched in caves, willing to die rather than surrender. The former raiders had walked into Iwo Jima as specialized operators reduced to conventional status. They emerged, those who emerged at all, as something else entirely, survivors of a battle that belonged to a different era of warfare. By April of 1945, the Pacific War had entered its terminal phase. The Japanese Empire, surrounded and suffocating, had retreated to its final defensive perimeter. Iwo Jima had fallen 2 months prior at catastrophic cost. The atomic bomb remained theoretical, locked away in laboratories and military planning rooms. What lay before the American military was not surrender, but a grinding, methodical campaign of annihilation across the islands that ringed Japan's home territory. Okinawa, the largest of the Ryukyu Islands and the closest American possession to the Japanese mainland, represented the gateway to invasion. Intelligence suggested that the Japanese military had fortified the island with over 100,000 soldiers, veterans hardened by years of island warfare and fanaticism deepened by the approaching certainty of defeat. The assault on Okinawa would be the costliest battle in Marine Corps history. It would also be where the last generation of Marine Corps raiders, scattered across a dozen different divisions and regiments, would spend themselves in combat so far removed from their origins that it might have belonged to an entirely different war. The raiders who boarded transport ships bound for Okinawa in late March carried with them no collective identity. They wore standard Marine uniforms, indistinguishable from 10,000 others. Their paperwork listed them as riflemen, squad leaders, or section commanders in the 4th Marine Division, the 22nd Marine Regiment, the 6th Marine Division. No document acknowledged that many had trained under Colonel Evans Carlson 3 years earlier, that they had charged across Makin Atoll in August of 1942 as members of an experimental combat force that rejected traditional hierarchy. No record commemorated that they had endured the rat run on Guadalcanal, the fever dreams of malaria, the ambushes in the jungle darkness. The Marine Corps had deliberately dismantled the raider battalions, absorbing their personnel into conventional units, and with that institutional act, the living memory of what the raiders had been was fragmented into thousands of individual narratives, each one isolated from the collective story. A man who had debated strategy in Carlson's council-style meetings now took orders without question from a conventional captain he had never met before boarding ship. Another raider, promoted to sergeant through merit and demonstrated capability, found himself under a reserve officer, fresh from stateside training, who carried military bearing like a weapon and demanded deference rather than competence. The bonds of shared purpose that had held the raiders together had been systematically severed by bureaucratic decision. The voyage to Okinawa took weeks. Transport ships crowded with Marines and supplies crossed the ocean in convoy. protected by destroyers and cruisers, vulnerable to submarines and aircraft, but ultimately unmolested as American naval dominance now extended across the entire Pacific. The sea had changed since 1942. No longer did the Japanese Navy threaten the fleet. Instead, scattered kamikaze aircraft represented the primary danger, and those attacks came in waves that could be anticipated and sometimes repelled. For men below decks, the voyage was a purgatory of heat, salt water showers that clogged pores rather than cleansed them, and food that sat like clay in the stomach. Former raiders, now indistinguishable from any other marine, stood in chow lines with rifle platoons they had known for weeks, rather than the men they had trained alongside through 1942 and 1943. One Marine might find himself seasick and vomiting into a bucket, while a raider from the 1st Battalion stood nearby. A man who had frozen malaria from his veins and walked across half of Guadalcanal, now silent and separate because military routine had transformed them into strangers. The war had a rhythm by this point, a terrible mechanical quality that reduced human beings to replaceable units. Individual memory and accomplishment mattered far less than unit designation and casualty replacement. Okinawa emerged from the Pacific on the first morning of the landing, a dark shape forming from heat shimmer and distance. The island stretched for roughly 45 miles in length and was densely forested, with limestone hills and ridges that would provide natural defensive positions for Japanese soldiers. American air and artillery had been pounding the island for weeks before the landings, but intelligence officers understood that such bombardment rarely eliminated an entrenched opponent completely. The Japanese commander, General Masahide Ushijima, had positioned his forces not at the beaches where American artillery could concentrate fire, but inland, along a series of defensive lines centered on the southern portion of the island. The strategy represented a fundamental shift in Japanese tactics. Rather than counterattack at the waterline, Ushijima intended to absorb the American landing, trade ground for time, and force the Americans into a grinding campaign of attrition where Japanese soldiers fighting from caves and fortified positions could inflict maximum casualties. The Japanese calculation was simple mathematics: kill enough Americans, wound enough others, and perhaps political pressure in the United States would force negotiation rather than continued combat. The former raiders went ashore on the first day of the assault, part of a landing that involved over 100,000 American troops. The beaches themselves proved surprisingly uncontested. Japanese artillery and machine gun fire came from the heights inland rather than from positions at the waterline, which meant the landings themselves achieved tactical surprise and proceeded with relative calm. Men waded through the shallows, formed up on the beach, and began the long advance inland toward the hills where Japanese defenses waited. The weather was oppressive, humid, warm even in April, and the Marines' heavy packs and ammunition belts began drawing sweat within minutes of landing. Former raiders, their bodies remembering 3 years of Pacific warfare, moved with practiced efficiency. They had learned in 1942 how to secure a landing zone, how to organize advance under fire, how to distribute ammunition and establish lines of communication. But this knowledge came from a different war, a different chapter of fighting. The raiders had been trained to move fast, to achieve their objective, and to extract before Japanese reinforcements could arrive. Okinawa demanded something else entirely, a methodical, grinding advance against an enemy that had no intention of retreating. By the middle of April, the Marine divisions had begun encountering the first major defensive positions. Japanese soldiers, many of them conscripts from Okinawa itself, with nowhere else to go and no possibility of withdrawal, fought with a combination of discipline and desperation. Machine gun positions commanded hillsides. Caves honeycombed the limestone ridges, each one a potential strongpoint that could not be bypassed without leaving enemy soldiers at the Marines' back. The tactical situation demanded that the Marines assault uphill against entrenched positions, exactly the circumstance that raider doctrine had been designed to avoid. Speed and deception held no value against an enemy dug into fortified positions that could only be captured through frontal assault and firepower. A raider who had learned to move silently through the jungle now found himself approaching a concrete pillbox across open ground, suppressing fire from his own unit, creating the cover under which he and half a dozen other men could move forward and place explosives. The innovations of 1942 seemed not merely obsolete, but quaint in the context of Okinawa. Disease, which had been the true enemy on Guadalcanal, returned with renewed ferocity. The dense vegetation and warm temperatures of Okinawa created perfect conditions for mosquitoes carrying malaria and dengue fever. Within days of the landing, medical personnel began reporting fever cases. By the first week of May, hundreds of Marines were being evacuated to hospital ships with malaria, dengue, and dengue fever. Former raiders, their immune systems already compromised by multiple previous infections, proved particularly vulnerable. A man who had survived malaria twice before found the third infection came with less severity but also with diminished recovery. The physical strength that had defined him when he stormed onto Makin in 1942 was gone, replaced by a gaunt frame that illness had hollowed out over 3 years. He fought anyway because stopping meant abandonment of his unit, and no raider carried that shame. The Marine Corps had learned to account for disease in its casualty projections, understanding that tropical sickness would reduce combat strength almost as effectively as enemy fire. Officers simply accepted that each regiment would lose roughly 30 to 40% of its personnel to medical evacuation before the campaign concluded. The Japanese defense of Okinawa proved extraordinarily stubborn. Week after week, the American advance slowed to increments. Instead of the rapid raids and maneuver warfare that had defined raider operations, the campaign became a war of positions. The 22nd Marine Regiment, where many former raiders served, found itself committed to sustained attacks against the Machinato Line, a series of fortified Japanese positions that stretched across the island. Casualty rates climbed steadily. Men who had survived Guadalcanal, Tarawa, and Saipan were now being killed in Okinawa. Some died from sniper fire. Others were killed by grenades thrown from caves. Still others were struck down by artillery fire or machine gun bursts that cut through their squad during advance. A former raider who had trained under Colonel Carlson's council system, who understood strategy and doctrine at levels most enlisted men never approached, could apply none of that knowledge to the circumstances he faced. He was a rifleman in a grinding campaign, and his sophistication meant nothing against a bullet from an enemy he could not see. By late May, nearly 5 weeks into the campaign, the Japanese main defensive line was finally beginning to crumble. American forces had suffered approximately 25,000 casualties by that point. Japanese casualties were far higher, estimated at over 50,000 dead and thousands more captured or surrendered. The deliberate Japanese strategy of attrition had worked partially. American casualties were higher than they would have been in a rapid campaign, but not high enough to force political pressure for negotiation. The Japanese military remained committed to fighting to annihilation rather than surrender. General Ushijima, recognizing that the defensive lines were collapsing, withdrew his forces to a smaller perimeter in the southern portion of the island and prepared for a final stand. The campaign that had seemed as though it might conclude by early May instead extended into June. For the surviving raider veterans, this meant weeks of additional combat, additional malaria, additional accumulation of trauma that their bodies and minds had not been designed to endure across 3 successive years. By June, the original cohort of raiders who had boarded transport ships 3 years earlier were no longer capable of rapid offensive action, even had the command structure permitted it. They moved through the campaign like ghosts of themselves, experienced fighters whose understanding of warfare was being applied in circumstances utterly alien to the doctrine they had learned. The tactical innovations pioneered by Colonel Carlson, the emphasis on speed, on psychological pressure, on creating superior coordination through collective ownership of strategy, had no application on Okinawa. Instead, they fought as millions of other American soldiers fought, as conventional Marines, as participants in industrial warfare where the individual was reduced to insignificance by scale and organization. That transformation, though logical and perhaps necessary in the context of a war that had expanded from small island raids to regional campaigns, represented a kind of strategic defeat that was never formally acknowledged. The raiders had been built to do one thing exceptionally well. The war had demanded something else entirely. Rather than reshape the war around the raiders' capabilities, the military had reshaped the raiders into conventional units and absorbed them into the machinery of standard warfare. Japanese resistance on Okinawa did not end until late June. General Ushijima, seeing his forces destroyed and his defensive lines collapsing, committed suicide rather than surrender. Hundreds of Japanese civilians, terrorized by propaganda that depicted American soldiers as subhuman killers, threw themselves from cliffs rather than submit to capture. The human cost of Okinawa ultimately reached 50,000 American casualties, making it the costliest battle in Marine Corps history, and demonstrating conclusively that the Pacific War would not end through rapid maneuver or psychological innovation, but through systematic attrition. Former raiders, now integrated fully into conventional Marine divisions, contributed to that victory, but without the tactical flexibility or independence of action that had defined their origins. They were victors in a war that had transformed them into something other than what they had trained to become. The surviving raiders emerged from Okinawa in late June, with approximately 130 days until Japan's formal surrender. The war would grind onward through the planned invasion of the Japanese home islands, an operation that would dwarf Okinawa in scale and brutality. But for these men, the story of the raiders was essentially complete. They had been built as something revolutionary. They had been dismantled as an institutional force. They had fought their final battle as conventional Marines in a campaign that bore no resemblance to the raids that had defined their origins. By the end of the Okinawa campaign, many had spent over 1,000 days in the Pacific theater. Disease had compromised their health. Combat had narrowed their understanding of human capability to what could be endured rather than what could be accomplished. The weight of accumulated survival had transformed them from the hungry, confident force that had conceived a radical new approach to warfare into tired men counting down the hours until either their rotation home or their death in action. What became clear by June of 1945 was that the experiment in tactical innovation represented by the Marine Corps raiders had been concluded, tested against the demands of industrial warfare, and found to be something less than transformative. The raiders had proven capable fighters. They had demonstrated that unconventional tactics could achieve tactical success in limited operations. But they had also revealed the limits of innovation when confronted by an enemy with unlimited willingness to sustain casualties. and a battlefield environment that demanded conventional firepower rather than psychological pressure. The institution had made its judgment. The raiders, as a distinct force, had ceased to exist. The veterans, scattered across multiple divisions and regiments, continued to fight because they were soldiers and because the war was not yet finished. Their sacrifice remained, but the narrative of their sacrifice had been rewritten. They were no longer raiders, they were Marines. In Okinawa, as artillery pounded limestone hills and Japanese soldiers died in caves, and Americans advanced across ground measured in meters rather than miles, the distinction between those two identities became finally, conclusively meaningless. The war in the Pacific ended not with a final battle, but with an emperor's